Welcome to the Switchblade Sisters Social Club, a true crime podcast where two sisters exploit their worst fears for your entertainment. You're welcome. I'm Dee.
And I'm Rhonda, and together we are the Sake Sisters. For more information, check out our website at www.switchbladesistersocialclub.com or find us on Instagram and Facebook at Switchblade Sisters Social Club.
Thanks for listening. Hi, this is Dee, and there's Rhonda. Hi. And we are the Switchblade Sisters Social Club, back for season 2.
Oh my God, how did this even happen? How did we even get season 1 under our belt?
Well, let me just say, where two sisters exploit their worst fear for your entertainment.
And you know what else? I'll never get over how fucking good our theme tune is, because our listeners have just heard it and I love it. It gets me in the mood like so much.
I'm right. Yeah, so excited that we have finished season 1. We really hope you enjoyed our little season break where we did a little throwback to We Knew the Moon episodes. That was my previous podcast, and we relaunched some episodes where Rhonda was my co-host, my guest co-host. So we did our Creepy Hotels episode. So good.
Loved it. I missed the paranormal stuff, you know. I'm going to mention some paranormal stuff today, but anyway, yeah.
Hybristophilia, our Hybristophilia episode, which is the one that Raphael Rowe listened to when he called us those two podcast girls. Winning at life. We also had our Urban Legends episode, which was basically just our love song to the 90s, really. Because we talked a lot about 90s movies in that episode.
Yeah.
And also our Cemeteries episode, where we talked about cemetery railways
and the body management system.
Like,
who would have thought that was, who would have thought that'd be interesting, but it is.
It really was. Also, we're super excited because in about 2 weeks' time, it's CrimeCon Scotland. And we have got a code for you guys. So if you go to the CrimeCon website, which is, let me find out for you guys, crimecon.co.uk, and if you put in the code SSSC, you get 10% off.
I so recommend it. CrimeCon was an absolute blast for like anyone into true crime. And not only do you get to meet all these like amazing people that you've seen on TV and stuff, and you know, real life detectives, but that alone, that's, you know, it was just phenomenally fun, a great experience.
Because it was definitely one of those kind of conferences and get-togethers where you actually get to interact a lot with the people there, the speakers, the content creators, and so forth. It wasn't like one where they fly them in and then they zoom out after their talk. They actually hang around. You get to talk to them. I
was shocked. Raphael Rowe's table was on the same floor as every other podcaster's table.
And he's just hanging out there for you to go up and say hi.
I did not expect that. I thought, like you said, he would just come on stage and come off stage when he's done, and that would be it. That's what you would see. But he was just on the floor, like you could just go and talk to him, you know, and loads of other amazing people.
Now, full confession, we've not been to the Glasgow one before, and Rhonda's not coming with me this time.
Because kids.
Because the kids, but I will be there, and apparently, and the Glasgow one is much a smaller event than the London one, but it means that there's even more interaction. So I'm so excited about meeting the speakers. They all sound fabulous. So we'll put links in there. And like I said, if you use the SSSC code, you get 10% off. I will be there. Come say hi. We would love, love, love to meet more of our listeners. We would love it. Colin Sutton's going to be there. So yeah. That's what we've been doing on our break, having a little throwback. We Knew the Moon throwback. Hope you enjoyed it. And now we're going to kick off season 2. And I am so excited about this because season 2 is kicking off with a patron choice. This is,
I can't fucking wait for this because I know who chose it. Can we say who chose it?
Yeah. Gina.
Okay, so Gina is, oh, love Gina. We discovered Gina on Instagram.
OG listeners.
Yeah, OG listener, friend of the show, amazing person, true crime connoisseur. Now, I know Gina knows true fucking crime. She knows even some of the most obscure cases that you've covered.
And can I say that this is why I felt a lot of pressure, because she chose this topic and I was like, fuck, I gotta do this justice. I gotta bring shit to the table that Gina doesn't even know, because I want to impress her.
Gina knows her shit. She knows true crime. And yeah, I mean, I'm always like impressed that she knows like the weird obscure cases that you pick, you know?
So
but I've never heard of. So yeah, okay, cool. Tell me, can't wait.
Right. So basically the reason why she's got this option to pick is because she is one of our dear patron supporters on a tier level that allows you to pick one of the topics. So go check out our Patreon page, patreon.com/Switchblade Sisters Social Club. We give you on there access to all of the video recordings of our episodes. They are largely uncut. I only cut out bathroom breaks, which sometimes happens. And also you can get some free merch. You get bonus episodes. So for example, when I went to New Orleans, I did a rundown of my trip to New Orleans and all the spooky shit that I did while I was out there. And yeah, if you pick one of the higher tiers, one of the benefits is that you get to pick a topic. So I emailed Gina and was like, Gina, love you, Gina. What's your topic? And she says, I'm going to read the email.
Are you going to do the reveal now?
Yeah.
Okay. I need to brace myself for the reveal. Okay.
You do need to brace yourself.
Okay.
You might not. I am sure you've heard of this case. You might not recognize it immediately off the back of the name. Okay. Because I will say it's an American case. That did reach over here. I remember it being in the news. I'm a little bit older than you, so I
how long ago?
1993.
Okay, we love a 90s crime. Okay.
Yeah, we love a 90s crime. I mean, we hate a 90s crime. Okay, so Gina says, hi Dee, I'm so excited to choose a topic. I have so many, but I'm going to ask for one that truly kicked off my obsession with true crime. So we love that, the starter case, the case. It is the West Memphis Three. I'm nearly crying just thinking about this one. It's so rough. And then she's written later on, please don't hate me.
Oh God, it's gonna be bad. It's gonna be bad.
It is rough. It's rough because there are multiple sets of victims in this. All of them are very young. So the initial, I got to put trigger warning because there's child murders. Sorry, I think I need to plug in my earphones quickly.
Yeah, because I just heard an airplane.
Yeah, that's because the window's open. I'm sorry, I can't keep them closed. It's too hot. Apologies for the plane noises. I'll try to talk over.
It's not unpleasant.
Okay, it's just where we live. Sorry. You know, our dear friend Isla, Criminally Good Books, York. Her husband is trying to identify my exact location based on information I share on the podcast because he's convinced that I share too much, especially the Levi Belfield episode.
God! Speaking of, tell me.
So now he knows I'm under a flight path. He's gonna.
Oh my God! Do you know what's so funny? Since we had Steve Gaskin on, DCI Murder Squad Detective Steve Gaskin, who talked about the increase in stalking crimes, our dads have been so freaked out about us getting stalked.
It's really weird because for the decades that I've worked on the issue of Israel-Palestine and had hate phone calls, hate mail, etc., I'm sure that's worried him, but not to the extent that this has. Anyway,
let's go back.
Sorry, we gotta go back because we've got so much to cover on this case.
Okay.
Nina, I hope you're proud of me. I fucking went in. This case, I want to put a major trigger warning. We have audience discretion advised on all of our episodes, but again, this one involves the murder of 3 children, 3 8-year-old boys, and the other victims are also young, and there's just so much god fucking awful stuff in this that it's a rough one. It is a rough one, but Gina, I could never hate you, okay? So, I'm going to start. My first source is Wikipedia.
Standard.
Yeah, this is my jumping off point. It's always a good jumping off point. Right? I did go much deeper than this, but I just wanted to give you a summary and then I'm going to go in deeper, okay? Because even in the summary, you're going to start noticing some motherfucking holes in this whole case.
Oh, I recognize the name. That's as far as I am at the moment.
Okay. So, in summary, 3 men, not really men, one was 16, one was 17, one was 18. 3 men in 1993 are convicted of the murder of 3 boys in West Memphis, Arkansas. This was the height of satanic panic. We escaped a lot of satanic panic in the UK, but it's important to remember that in the Bible Belt during the 90s, this was the height of satanic panic. People were worried about Satanists killing their kids left, right, and center, right? Mm-hmm. The men were accused of murder during a satanic ritual. There was, in quotation marks, dubious nature of evidence and emotional bias in court. Damien Echols was sentenced to death. Jessie Misskelley Jr. was sentenced to life in prison, plus 2 times 20 years on top of that. And Jason Baldwin was sentenced to life. So here's the crime. On the 5th of May, 1993, 3 8-year-old boys, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, were reported missing. Byers' adopted dad, John Mark Byers, was the first to report him missing at around 7 p.m. They were supposedly last seen by neighbors playing at around 6:30 p.m. Very limited searches were made that night by the police. It was dark and a kind of a semi-rural area. But neighbors and other civilians did have a look, especially in the nearby woods called the Robin Hood Hills. They apparently walked within meters of where the bodies were later found. The police only started their proper search the next day at 8 a.m., mainly around the woods again, where it was reported that the boys had last been seen. At 1:45 p.m., a black shoe was found floating in the creek in the woods. So the search focused around there and led to the discovery of the 3 bodies. So, sorry, this is a really rough bit, okay? They were naked and had been hog-tied with their own shoelaces, so their wrists tied to their ankles behind their backs. Chris Byers had cuts to his body and his genitals were mutilated. The autopsy revealed that Byers had died of multiple injuries and the other 2 had died from multiple injuries plus drowning. But then here's where it starts getting muddled. First, it was implied that the boys had been sexually assaulted. Then it was revealed that they had not been. Then there was reports of trace sperm DNA found on the boys' clothes. Then it was claimed that the murder, that the murderer had mutilated Christopher Byers' body, but then it was claimed that this was potentially done by animals post-mortem. There was also debate about the actual location of the murder. It wasn't clear whether where they were found was actually where they had been murdered, and no other crime scene was ever located. In 1994, a memorial for the 3 victims was erected at their elementary school, Weaver Elementary, and it was refurbished in 2013 on the 20th anniversary. So it's worth noting that this crime is now 30 years old. And although we accept that the 3 main victims are these 3 young boys who lost their lives at age 8, like with so many crimes, there's a whole other host of victims, including the 3 suspects that were jailed as a result of this. So yeah, I have an opinion on this. I'm going to state it from the outset that the 3 people that were jailed, that there was nowhere near enough evidence to convict them, and that there was a whole other host of suspects that perhaps there was more evidence to lead to the, investigating them further. Okay, so Jason Baldwin. He's 16. Damien Echols is 18, and Jessie Misskelley is 17 at the time of their arrests. Jason Baldwin and Damien Echols had already been in trouble with the law, but for things like vandalism and shoplifting, so minor crimes. Misskelley was also known to get in punch-ups at school and stuff like that. Jessie had already dropped out of school, but Jason Baldwin did really well at school and was really interested in graphic design. Damien had also dropped out of school. Jason and Damien were friends, and Jessie was an acquaintance more than a friend. They didn't really hang out, but they knew of each other because it's a small town area. They're around about the same age. But it is very strange that these individuals were even linked together in the first place. You know, if they're hardly friends, they're hardly going to go off and commit murders together, right? Damien Echols and the others came from quite poor backgrounds. Damien had been done for burglary, which sounds really bad, but it's because he ran away with his girlfriend and there was a rainstorm, so he broke into a trailer to shelter for the rain. So, you know, it's not the most horrendous of crimes, is it?
Yeah.
He's already on disability because he had spent time in mental institutions because of his depression. At the time of the arrest, he was working part-time with a roofing company, and his girlfriend, Dominique Tier, which is a great name, Dominique Tier, she was pregnant with their child. There were some other suspects at the time, and more suspects emerged later on. But let me tell you about some of the suspects that were on the radar at the time of the murders, soon after the murders. Chris Morgan and Brian Holland, they were also teenagers. They had drug offenses on their records. And 4 days after the bodies were discovered, they fled to California, which seems really suspicious. Morgan used to drive an ice cream truck in the area, so he would have been familiar with the boys. And on the 17th of May, 1993, so like 2 weeks after the murder, they were arrested in California. They were given lie detector tests. By the way, there's so many fucking lie detector tests in this case, even though at the time, it's acknowledged that lie detector tests are unreliable and not admissible in court. So it's like, why are you fucking doing them then? Now we know that they are problematic, but this lie detector test showed deception when they were asked about their involvement in the murders. Morgan says he has a drug problem and an alcohol problem, and he blacks out and has memory loss. So maybe he killed the boys, but then he very soon recanted the statement. California police sent their blood and urine to West Memphis Police Department, but there's no evidence that anything was done further with these samples.
Why would they not?
I don't know.
I mean, there's enough already. The fact that they fled 4 days after.
Right?
And that he say, I could have done it, but I blacked out. Well, what the fuck? That warrants further investigation.
Okay, this is the least.
That's a half confession, to be honest.
The least weird of the things that seem to be overlooked.
Oh, God. I'm already so fucking sad because it's 3 young kids.
Right?
Okay, let's go.
So then there was another suspect who was nicknamed Mr. Bojangles. He was an unidentified black male in the area at around 8:42 p.m. So this is exactly round about the time that the kids were murdered, on the 5th of May, 1993. Staff at the Bojangles restaurant, which was nearby where the kids lived and where they were found, saw a black man who seemed mentally disoriented, in quotation marks. He went inside the ladies' room. He was bleeding, and he actually brushed some blood up against the bathroom wall. They called the police, and by the time the police came, he was gone. Now, I've written at this point in my notes, did the police know at this moment about the missing kids?
And did they test whose blood that was? Oh, okay.
Okay, so more on this later. Anyways, the police officer that came to investigate didn't even go into the restaurant, didn't even go into the ladies' room where the man was found, didn't get samples of the blood-stained wall, didn't go look for the guy, even though he'd left within minutes earlier. The manager later called the police back after he heard that the bodies of these kids had been found to re-report about this guy. And the police only then, so days later, come back and investigate and look at the ladies' room. But apparently this man had a blue cast on his arm with Velcro, so they dismissed him because he couldn't kill 3 boys with a cast on. But it was Velcro. So you think that's weird too, right?
Yeah.
The manager of the restaurant also gave police sunglasses he thought that the man had left behind. And I read somewhere that these sunglasses were inside the lady's toilet, like a toilet. So I'm not sure if they meant inside the lady's room or inside an actual toilet, but police also took samples of the blood on the walls, which kind of grossed me out a bit because it's a restaurant. And so this blood was on the walls for days later. I don't know if they left it purposely because they were like, do you guys want this fucking evidence? You know? It was police detective Bryn Rich who took these samples and later testified that he lost these samples.
Oh my God. Oh my fucking God.
And FYI, later on, there was a hair from a black male found on the sheet wrapped around one of the victims, Chris Byers. So it's just already we're like, what the fuck, right?
How do you lose that? Surely must be instant dismissal. Losing fucking evidence.
It's crazy. It's crazy. Let's move on to the investigation. This is, by the way, still my summary, okay? Because I want to just give you top line and then we're going to go deeper.
I don't know if, like, you know, Hollywood films are to be believed, but it's always these fucking small town police stations that operate like poorly below.
You have no idea yet
how
fuck this is.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So early on, because of a lack of evidence of any other theory, in quotation marks, because to me there seems like there's lots of different evidence and lots of like routes of the investigation that could have been pursued. Because of this lack of evidence, police decide that the murders are culty. So they focus on Damien Echols because he's known to have an interest in the occult. Basically, what that means is he likes heavy metal music and he dresses in black. Damien Echols was interviewed on the 7th of May, 2 days after the bodies were found, and he was forced to take another lie detector test, which showed deception when he was asked about his involvement. Police detective Bryn Rich, the loser of the blood samples, is the one who interviewed Damien Echols. So he was not struck off, he was given more responsibility. And when Damien Echols mentioned genital mutilation of one of the victims, the detective thought this was incriminating because he was like, well, how'd you know about this unless you were the murderer? But by this point, lots of people knew about this because loads of stuff had been leaked to the press. Loads of people had been interviewed, and in the interviews, this had come up. And it's a sort of small town, so people fucking talk, don't they?
Oh, God, yeah.
So it was pretty much common knowledge at this point. The police decide that there's no other suspects at this point, not even Mr. Bojangles, so they focus in on Damien Echols. And on the 3rd of June, they interview Jessie Misskelley, whose IQ is reported to be very low. I don't like when they test young kids on their IQ and everything, but it's worth noting that he was clearly had some mental development issues. It's the 90s, so they don't really, you know, there's still a very strong lack of understanding on the brain, but even less so 30 years ago. But he clearly was struggling with developmental issues. And when he was arrested, he was taken into to be questioned. Apparently his dad gave the police permission to take him, but not to interrogate him. So I'm not entirely sure what the dad thought was going to happen, but still there was some legal issues about how this child was brought into the police. He was interviewed, this child, without parental supervision, without parental consent, and without any legal counsel for 12 hours straight.
Fucking hell.
How much of this do you think was recorded?
Oh, God.
46 minutes.
Oh, God. How did they justify keeping the kid for 12 hours, though, as well?
It's just...
Especially a kid with learning difficulties.
So during this time, surprise, surprise, Jessie Misskelley, confessed in quotation marks. But he also recanted saying this, saying he was a victim of intimidation, coercion, fatigue, and veiled threats. Also, I should say, his confessions didn't make sense anyways. They contradicted each other. They were inaccurate. They stated completely false things, you know. he clearly had no fucking clue what had actually happened in this murder.
And I also cast doubt over the fact that a teenager, he's a teenager, right?
Mhm.
Could tie up 3 boys and actually physically manage that.
Well, he supposedly was with the other 2 boys.
Okay.
But still.
Because that is quite an operation, you know?
Yeah.
Oh.
So part of Jesse's confession was made public to the press before the trial, which obviously impacts his chance of a fair trial. And then soon after, Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin were arrested. Now, I'm going to introduce a new player to the game because you might, like me, be wondering why the fuck Jesse was arrested, why he was linked to these other 2 that he barely knew. Like I said, they're not even friends, let alone murder buddies, you know? This new person, her name is Vicky Hutchison. And I think she might have trouble sleeping at night because...
Oh God, is she a suspect?
No, but she fucked these boys over big time.
Mm-hmm.
She had recently moved to West Memphis with her son, Aaron. Her son is 8 years old and was friends with the murdered boys. It's incredibly sad.
Mm-hmm.
Vicky was actually in the police station the day after the murders, but before they found the bodies, having a lie detector test of her own, because on a totally unrelated topic, she had been accused of stealing from her boss. She had to bring Aaron in because I presume she had childcare issues. She also said he was highly worked up because of the missing boys. So at this point, obviously, everyone knew the boys were missing. Loads of neighbors had been involved in the search the night before. The lie detector test was kind of inconclusive with regards to the stolen money. And this was done in the presence of Detective Dawn Bray. Apparently, it was also inconclusive because Aaron, her son, was kind of disruptive and distracting. But this is because Aaron started to tell the detective that the boys had been killed at the playhouse. Later on, the bodies had been found where Aaron kind of indicated that they had been played. But he says that he witnessed the murders and that the murders were done by Satanists who spoke Spanish. Which makes you wonder, like, how does an 8-year-old even know the word Satanist? But I suppose
it sounds like something he'd heard an adult say.
Yeah, the Bible Belt during Satanic Panic, he's probably raised to be fearful of anything that might be a Satanist, right?
Mm-hmm.
Over the next few days and weeks, they interview Aaron regularly. There's no playhouse where he said that there was a playhouse. He couldn't identify the 3 suspects. But, of course, the part of Aaron's statement where he mentioned Satanists is leaked to the press, and they go wild again. Because, you know, their priority, all these tabloids, is selling papers, not necessarily telling the truth. But it's clear at this point that police are suffering from confirmation bias, right? Anything that's sort of supporting their evidence, they're like, yep, jumping on it. Anything that doesn't fit in with this view that it's these 3 boys doing some sort of satanic ritual, they're like, nah, it's irrelevant. Or they lose it. So in June 1993, Vicky Hutchison agrees to be wiretapped during a meeting with Damien Echols. So you're like, oh, do they know each other? No, they don't know each other. Vicky goes on her own little mission to be her own little private investigator. She knows Jessie Misskelley because he babysits her kids, and she knows that Jessie knows of Damien because they're of a similar age. And this is how Jessie gets involved in this whole case.
And what is her incentive to meddle in the case?
She wants to find the murderer. She's a waitress. So she wants to help. She already knows police suspect Damien, and she knows of Jessie. So this is how Jessie gets linked into this whole case. The only reason his name kind of comes up in the first place. She asked Jessie Misskelley to introduce her to Damien. And here's where I start getting real Colin Stagg vibes, you know, setting up this honey trap, the confirmation bias, the complete dismissal of anything that doesn't fit in with our theory. During this random meeting, Damien doesn't say anything incriminating. Like, hi, my name is Damien and I commit satanic ritual murders. Like, what does she expect? So the police dismiss this, saying that the recording is not audible. So again, they're like, oh, there's no evidence. Let's just say it didn't work. And then Hutchison says that 2 weeks after the murder, she convinced Damien and Jessie to take her to a Wiccan meeting, and that Echols got drunk and confessed to the killing. But she later says something entirely different, so I will get to that. But basically, another person giving inconsistent statements, you know, without much evidence. I mean, even if Damien was a Satanist, that still doesn't mean he murdered these boys. That's still not evidence of murder.
And in 1993, this is before DNA testing?
DNA testing was like still early on. So, and they didn't really have any DNA evidence. And we'll get to it. She then says she couldn't remember the location of the meeting, and then she admits to making it all up to avoid the theft charge from her boss. And she was also really keen on getting the reward money, which was at $35,000 at this point, so a lot of money. She had boasted to loads of friends that she was going to get this reward money. So now let's move on to the trials. In summary, Jessie Misskelley was tried separately from the other two because of this thing called the Breton rule. Jessie's confession could not be used against his co-defendants who have not confessed. So he was tried separately, even though Jessie had recanted his confession. So there was a little bit of a reason why they were tried separately, but also you have to wonder how this is going to impact, you know, how one trial is going to affect the other, right? But for example, just a little heads up on how crazy the trials will be, and I will go into more detail. During Jessie Misskelley's trial, Richard Offshay, I don't know if I'm saying this right, was asked to speak. He's an expert of false confessions and police coercion. He's a professor of sociology at Berkeley, so about as expert as you can get, right? He said what happened to Jessie Misskelley is textbook police coercion. That much of Misskelley's confessions contradict each other. I'll go into that more depth. But for example, when he was first interrogated, it was still thought potentially, because of the delay in the autopsy reports, that the boys had been sexually abused because their anuses were dilated. Sorry, trigger warning again. So, of course, Misskelley says that he watched Damien rape one of the victims. But then the autopsy came out and proved that there was no sexual assault, and that apparently the dilation of the anus is a normal post-mortem condition. So basically, whatever the police thought at the time is what Jessie confessed to. Sadly, in February 1994, Jessie Misskelley gets convicted of 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. He gets life plus 2 times 20 years, so life in prison plus 40 years. And then, like I said, that must have impacted Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin's trial immediately after, because how can they be convicted? How can they be found innocent if Jessie's already been found guilty, you know? They were accused of 3 murders, Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin. A guy called Dale W. Griffiths was called by the prosecution. This is just one example of like how weird the trial must have been. He was supposed to be an expert in the occult and a graduate from the unaccredited Columbia Pacific University. So I looked into what that meant, because like, what does an unaccredited university mean? So I gather it's kind of like a private university that can just set up, decide they're a university without any kind of body regulating them. This university was actually closed by a California court in the year 2000. But at the time of the case, of the trial, there was already controversy around this university.
I mean, it sounds suspect, not regulated by any body. I mean, you know,
And this
having
is
worked
the
in
expert.
education. I know. Having worked in education, that rings alarm bells.
Yeah. So listen to some of the things that they found when they looked into this.
And they can
university.
issue qualifications.
They issued qualifications. This
No.
guy is a doctor, apparently, from PhD, right? So here were just some of the examples I found, right? And some of the reasons why they closed the university entirely. But all of this controversy was already out there, okay, about this university. Just took them a few years to actually get their shit together and close it down. For example, there was someone who submitted a PhD in Spanish, which was approved by 4 faculty members who spoke no Spanish.
This is exactly what I would expect from a
They found at least
Mickey Mouse University.
Not even. At least 4 students got their PhD in less than 12 months.
Okay.
Crazy.
Yeah.
So this university was shut down. But this guy, a doctor from this university, is the one they called as the expert in the occult, right?
I believe that he probably was an expert in the occult, but I mean, expert. I don't know.
Right.
Whatever. Cut that. I don't know.
So on the 19th of March, 1994, Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin were also found guilty of 3 murders. Damien Echols was sentenced to death, and Jason Baldwin was sentenced to life in prison. So literally just the worst sentences they could possibly get.
So the first guy,
yeah,
the one that made false confessions, did he ever change his mind and say, no, it wasn't me?
Immediately after he said the confession.
Okay.
Immediately. So
And he maintained that throughout the trial, maintained it wasn't me. And the other 2, obviously, they
basically the minute he got legal counsel and access to an adult, a functioning adult, he managed to get his shit together and not be bullied by the police as much.
Yeah.
Okay, so now I went in, right? That was just a summary. I wanted to give you top line what happened. It was going to be an unbiased summary, but I've already let all of my biases slip in because how can you not? Like, already it's fucking cuckoo bananas, right? So now I went in deep and I read this book called, I watched some documentaries and they were fantastic, which I'll talk about later. But my main source is a book called The Devil's Knot, The True Story of the West Memphis Three by investigative journalist Mara Leverett. She was from the area, so clearly this case meant something. It was personal, you know? So at this point, I'm going to show you a map. Okay? Let me show you a map. Bear with. Should really get these ready in advance. Okay, on this map, you should be able to see. Can you see my cursor? So you can see Michael Moore's house and Christopher Breyer's house. They live pretty much opposite each other.
Yeah.
Steve Branch lives a bit further away, but not far. This here in the top is the wooded area that they like to play. And this is where the bodies were found.
Okay.
Please note also that here we have the Blue Beacon truck wash. That will come up. And here we've got Bojangles. See how close that Bojangles restaurant is to where the bodies were found. Isn't that crazy? Okay, so that's a map of the area. Mara Leverett, she's a great writer, by the way. I really recommend this book. She starts this book off by saying that this trial would not be out of place in Salem 300 years ago. It was a witch hunt, literally. You know, it was just unbelievable. And I kept on going back to the Murder Investigation Team book, you know, by Stephen Keogh, how he lays out how a murder investigation, granted in the UK, not in the US, but how a murder investigation is supposed to be handled and how you have to get to 3 different stages of evidence. Enough evidence to arrest, enough evidence to interrogate someone, then you need to have enough evidence to convict them, and then to charge. Let me start that again. You need to accumulate enough evidence to arrest someone, then you need to accumulate enough evidence to charge them, and then you need to have enough evidence to convict them at court.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like they did not even have enough evidence to even bring them in for interrogation.
And do you think it was handled so badly because this is some small town?
It's like the perfect shitstorm.
Because would this have happened had it been in a bigger city like New York City, LA, whatever?
Okay, definitely not to the same extent, because we're talking here Bible Belt, right?
Yeah, because
so
honestly,
we're judged off the bat, because not only are they thought of as odd, like they might have been in New York or LA, they're thought of as unnatural, unholy, blasphemous. That's level. So, you know, the defendant's taste in music and in literature and in clothing was used as evidence. And it's really interesting because, like I said, I was reading this book off the back of reading Stephen Keogh's book, and, you know, what actually constitutes as evidence. And it's just, and again, off the back of doing all the Colin Stagg research, and it's just horrifying how many ties there are. So Mara, the author of this book, like I said, she took this case on. She felt it was personal to her because it's from her area, and she was obviously moved by just the lack of evidence used to ruin these kids' lives. And again, let's not forget, if these people are not the actual murderers, someone who genuinely was the murderer is out there still, and that's terrifying as well. So let's get back to the murders, and again, trigger warning. It's 7:41 p.m. on the 5th of May. John Mark Byers, who's an unemployed jeweler, reports his stepchild, Chris Byers, missing to West Memphis Police Department. 10 minutes later, a police officer arrives to his house. Byers reported last seeing his kid at around 5:30 p.m. So already it's a little bit unusual that he's so worried so quickly. It's out of character for him to be that worried about his kid that quickly. Some parents might notice if their kid is missing within minutes, right? It doesn't sound like this guy would have been. So it's a little bit odd that, you know, he's so convinced that his kid is missing so early on. Then the same police officer who takes the report of this child being missing responds to the call at Bojangles. Remember when I said, I wonder when they took the call at Bojangles if they were aware that there were kids missing? It was the same police officer. So she's just heard a child is missing, and then gets sent to a call out about a man acting suspiciously covered in blood.
And she made no connection, or had no suspicions that there could be a connection.
Whether she did or not, nothing further was done at this point. Like I said, she didn't even go into the ladies' room to investigate where he had left blood. She didn't try to find the guy, even though he left within minutes of, you know, minutes before she arrived, and presumably on foot because he was disoriented. She makes the report, but she takes no further action. She leaves the restaurant at 9:01, so less than 20 minutes before, since the restaurant called the police. She then went to another call out about someone throwing eggs at a house. So it seems like it's a really busy night for a Wednesday night, right? Okay, they're not all major crimes, but it seems to be back-to-back call outs. Then at 9:24, the same officer gets called out to another missing child report. So she gets called out to by I think her name, by Mrs. Moore, who's reported her son, Michael Moore, missing. The police officer noted that the kid was last seen riding his bike with Chris Myers, who had been reported missing, to her earlier that evening. And also Stevie Branch, who later was also reported missing. So at this point, she's received 2 call outs for 2 missing boys and a man acting suspiciously covered in blood. It doesn't link the 2 together. So a second police officer is the one that actually goes to a local restaurant to take a call from Pamela Hobbs, who reported her kid Stevie missing. He had not been seen since school. The police didn't really make many notes, seem to ask many questions, like who was responsible for the kid after school because the mom was working? How did she know the kid was missing? Because she was at work. So they didn't really do very much police work, if you see what I mean. Groups of parents were actually the ones that started looking for the kids rather than the police. So they mainly focused looking in the Robin Hood Woods, which is faced off with interstates and the truck wash. So terrifying, because you think how many people must be driving through and so forth. The kids were regularly playing in those woods, but they were always warned never to go there at night. So the police officer who went to 2 of the call-outs for the missing boys and Bojangles, she actually said she went to look in the woods, but she was driven out by mosquitoes.
Sorry, this is the police officer.
Yeah.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
And then the other police officer who took the report of Stevie Branch, the 3rd missing kid, he searched for half an hour without a flashlight.
It is just...
This is the only police action on that night.
Comedy of
Only
errors.
started the proper search the next day on the 6th of May at 8 p.m.
8 p.m.?
8 a.m., sorry.
Oh.
8 a.m. The chief inspector was a guy called Gary Gitchell. And it was only after several hours that he enlisted helicopters to assist with the search. They had 50 police officers searching and loads of citizen volunteers.
I just don't think that would happen these days. Like, I think they would bring out the helicopters instantly. Like, you wouldn't leave kids overnight.
I get that it's nighttime, it's a wooded area, so it's difficult, but to do nothing seems very strange. It'd be interesting how it would be handled officially today.
Yeah.
By noon, many of the searchers had left the wooded area because they'd been searching there for hours, and they decided to go off and search in different areas. But there was a juvenile officer called Steve Jones who was still searching the area when he saw a tennis shoe floating in the creek. And so they focused their search there and unfortunately found a bunch of the clothes and the 3 bodies of the 3 kids. They found the clothes wrapped around sticks and stuck in the mud of the creek, so to try to hide them. They found all the clothes except for 1 sock and 2 pairs of underpants. Again, trigger warning, Chris Byers, his scrotum was gone and the penis had been skinned and he was suffering stab wounds. It's now 3 p.m. The coroner only arrived hours later and pronounced the boys dead at 4 p.m. But by this point, they've been out of the water for several hours, which accelerates decomposition because they're now exposed to flies and insects. The autopsy was done the following day, but the reports were only sent out to the police weeks later. And initially, there were incorrect reports that the children had been sexually assaulted, as I said. At this point, I'm 2% into this book, and it's already just too much. But I'm still not hating Gina because this is an important case. There's very little evidence, and what evidence there seems to be, the police seem to be ignoring. So the vulture press kind of focus on the families, knocking on their doors and so forth, and really turn their head to this idea that it's a satanic ritual that the kids were murdered during. Rumors spread like wildfire, and of course everyone starts talking about the weird children in the neighborhood, right? It doesn't help that the case number assigned to this case was 93, which is the year, 05, which is the month, 0666.
Oh.
I mean, stupid. The police claim that the number is random, but apparently if the number was actually randomly given, it would have been 0555. Like, that would have been the next number in line or whatever. Here's where we start getting really fucking angry. The state governor at the time, Jim Guy Tucker, it's got such an American name, right? he offered to send in criminal investigation division detectives from the state level police. So this is local police, and he wanted to send in state level police. But Gary Gitchell said no. And I don't know how this is allowed. Like, it should be enforced, no?
Like out of pride, he didn't want the interference?
Well, maybe out of pride. Maybe because he wanted to keep tight control on the information, although he was doing this badly because everything so far seemed to have been leaked to the press. Or maybe it's because the officers involved were being investigated by the state police.
That's a fucking twist.
That is a twist.
For what?
So, this investigation started 4 months earlier, 4 months before the murders, and it involves drugs and corruption. The police investigating this murder case themselves were under investigation. A deputy sheriff was working as an undercover narcotic investigator. He'd been pawning evidence on the sly and evidence obtained during the investigation in order to buy drugs for himself. He pawned, for example, a police gun and a police car. He was murdered while undercover, which might have brought more attention to it. But he was not the only corrupt officer on the team. Several guns were missing from evidence. So were drugs and money. It really shows that you have to understand the politics of what's going on in a region and with everyone involved in a case, right? Mm-hmm. So, Lieutenant James Sudbury is a narcotic detective who is playing a pivotal role in this investigation, and he is being investigated because he took at least 4 weapons out of evidence in this way. So drugs and guns were being put into evidence, claimed to be destroyed, but actually the police were just taking them home. Mm-hmm. So they're clearly all bent as fuck, which is why they don't want additional eyes on them from the state police who are investigating these very police officers. Mm-hmm. These links were known, but it was decided nothing was going to be done about this. Now, let's look at John Mark Byers. This is Christopher's stepdad. He was also known to police, but never investigated. He had a colorful past as a drug dealer and a pawnbroker, but he seemed to be really chummy with the police, and especially Gary Gitchell. His wife, Melissa, had a history of heroin addiction, and he had 2 stepkids, Ryan and Chris. So Melissa had 2 kids, Ryan and Chris, and John Mark Byers was their stepdad. Byers had a difficult relationship with his wife. That is a euphemism. He had a son and a daughter with the first wife. And the first wife had made claims against him. She had claimed violence and death threats. He received he received a suspended sentence for violence against his first wife. He was already married to Melissa at the time. And all he had to do to avoid prison was to pay the child support and keep a job. He did neither, but he still managed to avoid prison. He claimed he was poor, and that's why he couldn't pay child support, while at the same time buying a new home with his new family with 3 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a swimming pool. Mm-hmm. Loads of people wondered how Melissa, a cleaning lady with a heroin addiction, and Byers, who sold jewelry at a flea market, could afford this. Also, they had a weird friendliness with the police. Again, they were like suspect, and yet the police would regularly come over for barbecues and hang out. So it became clear that they were, Mark Byers was an informant, basically. That's why he was all friendly with the police.
Okay.
Because he had a lot of charges against him for selling cocaine, for carrying dangerous weapons, and he was inexplicably not charged with any of them, or charged with suspended sentences, and so never did jail time. 5 months before the murders, he was under suspicion for felony theft, because UPS delivered 2 gold Rolex watches to him worth $11,000. And he claimed he didn't receive them. Mm-hmm. So fraud was suspected, and the UPS reported it to the police. The police did nothing about it, so UPS escalated it to Arkansas State Police. this case was technically still open when the boys were murdered. So as I mentioned, when the bodies were found, there were loads of different routes the investigation could have taken. It could have been a stranger to the boys, it could have been someone they knew, or it could have been a satanic cult. Now, we know which one the police were focusing on, right?
And did you say earlier that this guy, the buyer's dad, is the adoptive dad?
Stepdad.
Stepdad, okay.
Now, the kid was found, Christopher Byers, in the post-mortem, was found to have belt buckles indented in his body. And his stepdad, John Mark Byers, admitted that earlier that day he had given him a few licks. So basically had beat him with the belt. Explaining away supposedly why there were these marks. Okay, so you would have thought step one in any murder investigation is to eliminate the family of the suspects. We see this time and time again into different reactions, right? I mean, we like to think that if anything happened to someone close to us, we'd be like, yeah, please investigate me, rule me out so you can focus on who genuinely did it. But we don't know how the families reacted to this because it wasn't even done. Steve's dad, Steve's parents had been divorced and the mom was awarded full custody, and the dad was only given permission to see Stevie under her supervision. He was ordered to pay $250 a month in child support, but by the time Stevie was 7, the dad owed $13,000 in child support and also was owed a bunch of back taxes. But he was never investigated. None of the early interviews with parents were recorded, despite the magnitude of the crime. John Mark Byers and his ex-wife was mentioned in the reports, but nowhere was it mentioned that she accused him of assault. There was another parent at a parents' evening soon before the murders who overheard the Byers talking about how they had to get rid of Chris. Because he was causing disruption in the classroom. Now, remember how I said they love a good old fucking lie detector test? While they polygraphed 41 people during the investigation, none of them was a relative to the victim. They fingerprinted 50 people hoping to find a match for a fingerprint found in the woods, but they never did find a match. They took hair samples for 41 people. They took blood and urine from 11. Some of those were from the victim family. The reports were sent off, but I guess they didn't prove anything. Ryan, the other stepkid, reported that Christopher's stepdad was angry with Christopher on that day because Christopher had broken a seal on the window to get into the house and was in trouble. Presumably that's what the licks were for. John Mark Byers, though, was only recorded during his police interview 2 weeks after the murder. He was being interviewed by Detective Rich, who was also investigating Byers regarding the UPS Rolex watch fraud, which seems unusual. And he was also being interviewed by James Sudbury, the police officer who himself was under investigation. So it's just really upsetting. There's also loads of inconsistencies with Byers' timeline. For example, he says he went into Midtown Memphis to pick up Ryan, the other stepkid. But in order for him to do this, he would have had to do it in record time because the timings just don't line up. He also said that Ryan also said that he went to bed at midnight, but John Mark Byers says that at midnight they went to the truck stop to go and see if they could find any sign of the kids. Police never really asked him about this. He also spent hours in the woods searching after the kids went missing, which seems like a normal thing for a parent to do, but the police never asked him what he was doing in there, where he searched or anything. So, you know, was he disposing of bodies? Was he hiding evidence? He could have been. No one fucking knows.
I'll tell you one thing that sticks in mind is that you said that he reported his son missing or his stepson missing really early on, and he wasn't the type to be worried.
Yeah, it's just unusual. They didn't ask him, why were you so worried so early on? Like, you would notice if the kids were missing within minutes. Right? Whereas he didn't seem that type. Sorry, I know there's so much, and I know I'm going back and forth, but it's because all of it is just all over the place.
It's a twisted, convoluted tale.
Right?
Yeah.
Only 3 weeks later did they interview Ricky Lee Murray, who was the biological dad of Chris Byers. He lived in Indiana and he had an alibi, so he wasn't under suspicion, but it still seems weird that they only interviewed him 3 weeks later. Chris Byers' parents, by the way, you know, the ones that wanted to supposedly get rid of him, had been taking him to a pediatric neurologist because the mother was, in quotation marks, at her wit's end, according to the pediatric neurologist. The last appointment was only 4 months before the murders, and supposedly there was no improvement in Chris's behavior. So basically he was a bit difficult. Were the Byers being responsible, or were they getting fed up by the situation? 3 weeks after the murder, Arkansas State Police find that John Mark Byers had received these Rolex watches and sold them on to a chiropractor. So basically he was guilty of fraud, pretending he hadn't received these $11,000 worth of watches. But this miraculously disappeared again, and he served no jail time. So we're on the 26th of May now, at 20 days after the murder, and there is still no autopsy report. So what this means, for example, is that we still have no idea of the time of death of the boys. We know what time roughly they went missing, but we have no idea of the time of death. Were they murdered immediately? Were they kept somewhere? In absence of any real evidence, the weird theories continue to take over. Now, I want to introduce a villain to the piece, Jerry Driver. He's a juvenile officer who initially suggested Damien Echols as a suspect because of Damien's fascination with the occult. I mean, lock us up, right? We had a whole fucking podcast season about paranormal shit.
And it wasn't unusual in that era, like we said with Colin Stagg in the 90s. It was, you know, it was a popular thing to be into back then.
And to be interested in, you know? Damien came on his radar a year and a half earlier because a woman reported that he was threatening her daughter, Deanna Jane Halcombe, who was 15 at the time. Damien and Deanna had been dating. Damien was 17 at the time. It had ended the week previously, and Damien was not taking it well, supposedly harassing Deanna and a male friend of hers who he threatened to kill. So that's how Damien Echols gets on Jerry Driver's radar. It's not a good look, threatening someone like that, but also it's not actual murder. Again, I want to emphasize that this is the height of satanic panic, but in 1991, people were so obsessed with this fear of satanic panic and Satanists are going to steal your children and slaughter them and blah, 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 that the FBI did a study, and I mentioned this in a past episode of We Knew the Moon. FBI did a study into old records to see how much of a problem Satanism actually was, and they found that it was involved in 0 major crimes. And only occasionally in vandalism and cruelty to animals, which I count as a major crime and definitely can be something that escalates. But this idea that Satanists are killing kids left, right, and center was completely inaccurate, 100% false. And Damien identified as a Wiccan, not as a Satanist, which is not the same thing at all. But ignorant people are ignorant, right? Damien had also been hospitalized for a few weeks at a time because of depression. And again, there was a stigma about mental health at the time. So after one of these stints in hospital, he was released, and his mom moved him and his sister to Aloha, Oregon, where she got back with his bio dad. That's biological father. I like the word bio dad. Jerry Driver was still on his case, though. So even though he'd moved out of his area, Jerry Driver contacted Oregon police, the juvenile department there, and asked them to keep an eye on Damien, as he was still on probation. Fair enough. But in this referral, Driver said that Damien was a Satanist. Damien always rejected that he was a Satanist. Damien and his girlfriend had both been in a psych ward, which was incorrect. Only Damien had. His girlfriend, that Damien threatened to kill his girlfriend's parents, also incorrect. And that they were trying to have a baby so that they could sacrifice it to Satan, also incorrect. Oregon Juvenile Department did their bit. They went and had an interview with Damien. They found that he was settling in well. He was working at the petrol station where his bio dad was also working. And they recommended that Damien was supervised at a minimum level until he turned 18 in about 4 months' time. Jerry Driver was not happy with this, but Oregon police ignored him. 2 months after they moved to Oregon, though, Damien's parents reported to police they were worried that Damien would hurt himself or others. He was taken to hospital where he was found to be coherent and denied any involvement with devil worship or Satanism. Damien was admitted to a psych ward and put under suicide watch. He admitted he was depressed, but he didn't have suicidal thoughts. A family counselor assessed that this was a troubled family and that there was no real relationship between the son and his biological father. And both parents were not keen on having Damien around because he was difficult. It makes me so sad because, you know, we just see so many failings of the adults in this case as well. Damien reports really missing his friends, especially his best friend Jason Baldwin and his girlfriend Deanna at the time. After 2 days in hospital, he's no longer deemed a danger to himself or others, but his parents didn't want him around and he was really homesick. The doctor said that because he was a couple of months off turning 18, it was totally acceptable for him to move back to Arkansas. Jerry Driver was notified of this. Remember the juvenile officer who was just obsessed with Damien. Driver was not happy with this, so he took Damien into juvenile detention. And he was only released when he promised to visit Jerry Driver weekly to complete his GED, which is like high school diploma that you can achieve if you've dropped out of high school if you're older. And Damien did all this. But Jerry Driver was still on his motherfucking case. Damien starts seeing Dominique here at this point, right? She's 16. He starts working part-time at a roof company, so he seems to be settling in and adjusting, right? He's regularly attending his mental health appointments. He confesses to his therapist, and his therapist shares his confidential notes with Jerry Driver. But he confesses to his therapist that he drinks blood occasionally, but he specifies that this is with a sexual partner. Now, to me, that implies consent. It's gross, but it implies consent, and we know that there are people whose kink this is. I don't mean to kink shame, but I wouldn't be able to do it.
Yeah, it makes me want to gag a little bit.
Right? But remember, we're in the Bible Belt, right? So they didn't just think Damien was weird. They thought he was unholy and blasphemous. Preachers were quoted in the media as experts on this case and condemned Damien to a fiery hell. Damien at this point turns 18, so he's not even under Driver's jurisdiction anymore because Driver is a juvenile officer responsible for juveniles, but Driver is still obsessed with him. So when the bodies are found, Jerry Driver insists that it's Damien. Because by this point, Jerry Driver thinks that Damien is a cult leader. Like, what the fuck is going on with this guy that he's so obsessed?
You know, I think it just sounds like they have an agenda to make, especially, you know, when the police have got to make an arrest, right? They get pressure to make an arrest. And like, were these three boys, they were presumably quite high profile in that town already, right? Just from being.
I mean, they had, two of them had very minor records, you know? So I'm sure there must have been worse people if they wanted to just pin it on someone.
Or easy targets if they're trying to turn their attention away from, the buyer's kid's stepdad.
It just seems like, I said, the perfect shit show. A whole bunch of different things that came together in a really unfortunate chain of events that led to these boys being in the spotlight while the police are trying to keep everyone looking away from the fact that they are themselves being investigated, that possibly one of their informants is very suspect in this case. Okay, so Damien has one really good friend, Jason Baldwin, who used to live nearby. Jason Baldwin also skates and skateboards and listens to heavy metal music. I mean, they basically have a playlist like ours at the time, right? Guns N' Roses, Metallica, Ozzy Osbourne. And I'll give you this one as a dodgy, suspicious addition. U2.
You know what? I actually love U2.
I love you.
But it doesn't always. I'm not sure I put them on the same playlist as Metallica and Guns N' Roses, but I do love U2.
So, but this is a place where people were listening to pop music and country music, and if you were something different, there was something weird about this. So let's have a little look at Jason Baldwin. His dad fucked off when he was 4, and reportedly came back for one Christmas like 11 years later. So out of the picture entirely, let's say. His mom was super protective of him and made him check in every hour when he was out. Which, this is a time before mobile phones, so it's super cute, but probably problematic. She worked really hard and she suffered from depression, and she'd even tried to kill herself once, and Jason was the one that found her and saved her life.
So sad.
Jason did believe in God, but he thought it was something that you kind of focus on your deathbed. So he wasn't that bothered about it. Whereas Damien was very interested in learning about different religious practices. Again, nothing wrong with that. Jason Baldwin was also known to juvenile authorities because in 1990, when he was 12, he was playing in a rusted-out tin building near the trailer park. He was playing there with his 10-year-old brother and some other kids, and he got charged with breaking and entering into this building that didn't even have 4 walls. Like, come on. Just send them home and give them a warning. Do you know what I mean? More for their safety rather than anything. Because they also claimed that they broke windows of these, like, vintage cars when actually they were just rusted-out cars in this rusted-out tin shed. So you would have thought the biggest concern was for the kids' safety in this kind of, abandoned building rather than, like, charging them with breaking and entering. Come on. Jason was put on probation, and his mom was ordered to pay $450, which was a huge amount for her at the time. And on that note, I think we should take a break, because I need to refresh my coffee. So I needed that break because it was getting a lot. Back to the investigation in quotation marks, because it's ridiculous. So we see confirmation bias in the extreme. For example, there were some interviews with someone who said that they saw 2 black men and a white man come out of the woods. But then the police officer scribbles underneath that this was clearly cult activity because they regularly black up in cult activity, which I've never heard of before. Have you? But where we have heard this before is Vicky's statement, where she said that all of the people at the SBAT, the Wiccan meeting that she went to, were all covered in black. But then she also later took this back and said that she'd made it all up. So when interviewed about the whereabouts that night, by the way, Jason and Damien said that they'd gone to Jason's uncle's house where Jason mowed the lawn. Damien's dad picked them up because, remember, Damien didn't drive, at 6 p.m. and drove Jason and Dominique home. And then Damien talked to 2 girls on the phone. Both of them confirmed this, as did his mom. By the way, this interview, quotation marks, happened in the yard. Their Miranda rights were not read. There was no legal counsel. There were no parents present. They were not told that they were suspects, etc., etc., etc. Like I said, there was loads of debate about how Damien knew about genital mutilation, etc. But by this point, it was widespread knowledge because all of this stuff had been leaked to the press. All of these people had been asked about it during their interviews, and I'm sure talked to each other about it. Damien agreed to a polygraph, and they said that it indicated deception, but there's no record of it. And his interview was not recorded. So let's go back to Vicky Hutchison. Remember the woman who was brought in because her boss suspected her of stealing? Well, she calls the police and she says that she's been hearing talk in the neighborhood about cult activity. Of course she was. Everyone's fucking talking about it because the police are implying heavily that it's a cult killing. She told the police she was going to play detective, in quotation marks. And the police were okay with this. Again, she's a waitress. Like, why are you telling her? Don't get involved, lady. She said she knew Jessie Misskelley because he babysat for her kids sometimes. At the time, the police had been very vocal about their suspicion of cult activity and specifically about Damien. The people that were being interviewed were specifically being asked about him and his cult activity. So again, people talk, right? They're coming out of these interviews saying, oh, the police asked me about Damien. Vicky decides she's going to set Damien up through Jessie, even though Jessie and Damien aren't even close. Let me just talk to you about Jessie for a little bit, right? He's 5'1", so he's tiny. We've mentioned that he has development issues, learning issues. He was known to be a scrappy kid. His mom left when he was really young, and his dad married a few times afterwards. Jessie had 9 siblings. The family were described as loving but rough, in quotation marks. He was labeled slow in school and he was put in special classes, but he often lashed out, which we see in kids that are struggling. I mean, you're a teacher, right? You were a teacher. You must have seen this a lot, right? The frustration of not being able to follow, not understanding, and having difficulties with their mental health and their mental maturity. He got counseling, but the family couldn't afford a lot of the treatments that were recommended to them, such as hospital stays and psychiatric wards. At 8 years old, he was suspended from school for fighting and sent to a psychiatrist in Memphis. The result was, in quotation marks, that he was a boy who was non-psychotic. Sorry about this term, but he was not retarded. That was the wording used. And he feels bad about himself and the world and his world. He sees himself as vulnerable because he fucking is, and unable to handle the pressures which surround him. And he is in danger of being overwhelmed. So sad, isn't it? This is at 8.
Yeah. And these are a lot of the words used to describe a child who's autistic: vulnerable, overwhelmed, lashing out.
Right.
And that's why it's really sad, because in the fucking 90s, they knew nothing about this.
They knew nothing. Like I said, still so much to learn about the brain and the mind and neurodiversity and mental health issues and mental conditions. Even less was known at this time. So he clearly struggled and lashed out because it was the only way he knew how to respond. His father admits to being a fighter too and roughhousing with the kids. So again, they're setting an example. The psychiatrist recommended a residential stay in a psychiatric ward, but they couldn't afford this. And they also soon stopped Jessie's counseling. So yet again, it feels like adults failing kids, right? I know that they were in a difficult situation, 9 kids living in poverty. It's just so sad. It's just so sad. Jessie repeated kindergarten and also the 2nd grade. At 10 years old, he was still considered behind academically and emotionally. By 11, he was viewed as a danger to others. He had hit a girl in the head and stabbed a boy with a pencil and punched windows out of a car, cutting his hand badly. He got suspended for spraying ketchup around the lunchroom, which did make me laugh a bit. But this meant that he got sent for another psychiatric test. His parents were both meant to go, but at this time, his dad was in prison for selling weed. By 16, he was in the 9th grade. And from memory, 9th grade is when you're roughly 14 years old. But he was considered to be at the level of a 4th grader. and he soon dropped out of school. Again, I just feel like it's failure upon failure on this poor boy. He sometimes thought that he might become a mechanic like his dad, or sometimes he thought he would become a professional wrestler, which seems like a very typical dream of a boy that age in the 90s, right? But mainly he was living, in quotes, just one day at a time, which is so sad for a kid at that age, right?
I'm so sad about him.
It's just heartbreaking. Then Vicky Hutchison moves nearby with her 2 kids, and this guy is the guy she picks to babysit, which seems questionable to me. Like, I sympathize with him, but I also don't think I'd leave my kids with him, right? Vicky...
Even, do you know what I mean? Like, any 9th grader, to be fair. Any 14-year-old. You know, 14 to, I don't know.
Look, it was a time where kids were babysitting kids, and that was considered normal. Vicky clearly had her own difficulties and struggles and pressures, but it does make me think that she is responsible for some questionable behavior as well. Like I said, he doesn't seem like an ideal babysitter because he's going through his own fucking shit, right? Vicky asked Jessie if she knew Damien, and this was after the boys were found, the bodies of the boys were found. Jessie said, yeah, but not well. I mean, it's a small area and they're similar age, so I'm sure they knew of each other. Vicky asked Jessie if he knows Jason, and Jessie says, yeah, he's known him since the 6th grade and that Jason was nice. She tells Jessie that she wants to go out with Damien. For the record, she's 32. So Jessie says he would introduce them.
So she's manipulating and coercing him. Yeah.
And this is off her own back, mainly. She reports this to the police, meaning Jerry Driver, who, remember, has it out for Damien Echols. The police decided Vicky should pretend she's interested in the occult. So as her training, you know, to go undercover, what do you think they do? They tell her to go to the library and read some books on the occult. She doesn't even have a library card, so she has to borrow Jerry Driver's library card. I mean, this is someone they supposedly suspect of a triple murder, and they're like, yeah, just read some books and go off on your way. Jessie brought the boys, Damien and Jason, to Vicky's house and left them there. 15 minutes later, he saw Damien's mum driving down to pick up Damien, so meaning that their meeting was very, very short. So they weren't at Vicky's house for very long, and Vicky claims, though, that it was the start of an 8-day romance with Damien.
Ew.
She emphasizes that there was no sex involved, and that she claims this was all for the sake of her private detective work. She's a waitress! Apparently, Damien talked about the murders and how the police kept on questioning him, which, like, seems fucking normal to me, because that would have been a big thing in his life. Vicky said she wanted to learn more about Satanism, so Damien invited her, apparently, to an SBAT, which is a Wiccan thing. It's a celebration normally based around the moon, the phases of the moon. Now, it just seems like such a risky, stupid operation, you know, for the police to send this woman off to do.
And so her motivation is the $35,000, right?
Yeah, and remember, she's still in trouble for potentially stealing from her boss. So Wednesday, the 19th of May, 2 weeks after the children disappear, the police send Vicky off to investigate this suspected triple murderer, having read a couple of library books as her training. Damien apparently picks her up in a red Ford Escort and drives her and Jessie to an SBAT. Now remember, Damien doesn't drive. Also, no one known to him owns a red Ford Escort. This car has never been found. Apparently, Damien drove them all to a field where there were about 10 people, and their faces were painted black. They took off their clothes and started touching each other. Vicky was offended and asked Damien to bring her home. Jessie, he did, and left Jessie behind. Vicky said she couldn't identify anyone because of their face paint and because they all used nicknames like Lucifer, Spider, and Snake. And
so you're saying this didn't happen? There was no red Ford Escort. This whole event didn't happen.
She later claimed to have made it all up.
Oh, fuck's sake.
Which seems obvious because it seems fucking ridiculous.
Mhm.
And remember, she's still being accused of stealing from her boss at this time. This is an accusation which miraculously and mysteriously went away. So was it because she was helping the police with this investigation? At this point, they decide to interview Aaron further. Remember her son, who was a friend of the murdered boys. And again, he says that they were in a clubhouse. They used to spy on these men in the woods who sang songs about the devil and did, in quotation, what men and ladies do. It should be noted that Vicky is described in a way that I interpret as being attractive. So again, another reason maybe why she's taken a bit more seriously, you know? And also everything she's saying is supporting their confirmation bias. At one point, Vicky presents a skull earring that she says Damien forgot at her house one time. And she says that when Aaron saw it, he said that one of the men that he was spying on was wearing one that was similar. The police ask if they can hide a tape recorder in her bedroom so she can invite Damien over. Vicky agrees, but when nothing interesting is said on the tape recording, the police claim that the quality was poor. But I mean, did they not even check the setup before they press record, you know? This tape recording also disappears. Jessie still at this point has no idea that Vicky is working with the police. And when he does find out, he says all of it is bullshit. On the night of the 2nd of June, Jessie is actually staying at Vicky's house because she's supposedly scared of a prowler. And the next morning, he's woken up by police who want to interview him. He goes to the police station. He has no idea what this is about. They take his height and his weight, and they make a note of his tattoos, which seems a bit much for just an interview, right? By the way, he had a tattoo which said FTW. Do we know what that's? FTW.
For the win?
Yeah. But you know what the police mark it down as meaning?
Oh, God.
Fuck the world.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
And remember, Jessie is not very emotionally and mentally mature. So he doesn't understand half of what's going on. He's a minor and his parents are not with him, let alone a lawyer. They apparently get permission to interview him from his dad, but I mean, this is like fucking laughable because basically they find his dad in a McDonald's restaurant and ask him there if they can interview his kid. They make Jessie take a polygraph, which shows deception. Police told Jessie that the machine could read his mind, and he said that he was all confused. Like, they're clearly manipulating him. He was interrogated for hours. And at one point, he was asked if the boys were tied up. This is the first that Jessie knew about the boys being tied up. And he was basically forced to say, yes, they were tied up. They asked him what they were tied up with. And when Jessie said rope, because that seems like an obvious answer, the police got mad and said, God damn it, Jessie, don't mess with me. Because of course the correct answer was shoelaces. The kids were tied up with shoelaces. So basically they kept on yelling at him until he came out with the correct answers. And then he'd be like, oh, good boy. Like almost like positive reinforcement.
Yeah. And a kid, you know, let's say he had the mental maturity of a 4th grader. You think you're supposed to do what adults tell you to do.
Yeah, especially adults in authority. In quotation marks, he says, they hollered at me until I got it right. Up until this point, like I mentioned, nothing was recorded. Police made it clear that Jessie wanted to be on their side and not on Damien and Jason's side. So, i.e., there's a right answer and there's a wrong answer. After hours of interrogation, Jessie starts opening up about Damien and Jason, claiming that they wanted to hurt the boys and weird shit. Like, here's some of the ridiculous stuff that Jessie comes out with. That they regularly had meetings that were held on a Wednesday, by coincidence. That was the night the boys were murdered. Sometimes people bring dogs and they usually kill the dog and eat the dog as part of the ritual. He also said there was no meeting on the night of the murder, and then Jason and Damien were having sex together, that someone brought a briefcase with drugs and guns, etc., etc. And then he admitted finally to being witness to Damien and Jason murdering the 3 boys. And it's at this point the police decided to start recording the confessions. So they, after hours, finally get him to start saying what they want, and then they press record. So this is at 2:20 p.m. And remember, he was picked up at 9 a.m. So he's being questioned and interrogated this entire time. Up until this point, Jesse's worst crime, by the way, had been stealing flags from a high school marching band. He wanted to build a speedway and he needed flags. Just like hardly the crime of the century. When the tape recording started, Jesse says that on the 5th of May, the day the boys went missing, he got a phone call from Jesse Baldwin to ask him to go to West Memphis with him and Damien. They went to the woods, and there Jesse saw Damien hit one of the boys real bad and started screwing them and stuff, in quotation marks. Jesse was vague about which boy Damien hit, and Jesse says all of this happened in the morning, but we know that the 3 kids went to school that day until 2:45 p.m. So it's bullshit. Jesse says the other 2 beat the boys, took their clothes off and tied them up and assaulted them sexually. But remember, later on, we find out that the boys were not sexually assaulted. But at this point, the police suspected that they were. At that point, Jesse supposedly ran home. So now Jesse's not confessing any longer to witnessing or partaking in the murders, but he's saying that he saw them beat the boys, tie them up, etc., etc. But Jesse says that he was home by noon, which is still before the school had let out. So the kids are still supposedly at school. Jesse claims the kids skipped school that day, which we know is incorrect. So the police are obviously annoyed about this timing discrepancy, right? Because they know the kids went to school and disappeared after sort of 6:30 p.m. So they asked Jesse if he wears a watch. Jesse says he forgot it that day. So police say maybe your timing is off, and Jesse agrees. But by a whole fucking day, like, you know, it's just ridiculous, right? Then Jesse says that Christopher Byers was choked to death, even though there was no evidence of choking in the postmortem. They then take a 27-minute break, obviously frustrated that Jesse is saying a bunch of stuff that doesn't corroborate what they want to prove. And lo and behold, when they press record again, Jesse's statement changes again, and the timings are different. He says he's now in the woods at 5 or 6 p.m., but the police say you didn't have your watch on, so could it have been 7 or 8 p.m.? And Jesse says, yeah, sure. But Jesse is still saying the boys are tied up with brown rope and not with the black and white shoelaces that they were actually tied up with. So this line of questioning is quickly dropped, you know? Let's move on. Now let's go on to the arrest of the other 2. It's rare to do a nighttime arrest, and in the state of Arkansas, there has to be a very real reason why you would do an arrest or a search at night, and there's a very clear definition. You can only have a property or a person searched at night if it is difficult to approach the property by the day, or if there's a threat to the police from a daytime search, which I don't really know how that would be, but yeah. This does not apply to the 3 trailers that the boys live in. And they also claimed that there was a fear that evidence would be destroyed, but this is 30 days since the murder. So why do they suddenly think that within the next 24 hours, they're going to be destroying evidence? So it seems a bit ridiculous. But Deputy Prosecutor Fogelman, who is one of the villains of the piece, petitions for permission for a nighttime search and arrest of the 3 boys' houses, and also Dominique Tier, the girlfriend of Damien. The reason given is that they are in a cult, which is not one of the legal reasons that you are allowed to do a nighttime search and arrest. The Judge Rainey granted this, and also for the arrest of Damien and Jason. Jason was at Damien's house celebrating passing the 10th grade.
Oh my God.
And Damien's parents were out because they planned to go and check out a new casino that had opened nearby. And they did for their kids one of the most 90s things that comes up in this case. They rented a TV and a VCR for Damien and his sister to watch in the evening. And Jason and Dominique were also there, and they were watching The Leprechaun when the police showed up.
Oh, the horror film.
Yeah.
That's a funny film.
It is funny. Damien was not surprised since the murders. He had been surveyed. The police had been camped out on his driveway. He'd had multiple interrogations, etc., etc. Damien and Jason were charged with 3 counts of murder. Jason was 16 at the time when he was taken to jail. He was stripped in a cell. He was given police-issued clothing that were too big and wouldn't stay on. Again, he's a child. He was taken to hospital for dental x-rays, and samples of his hair, blood, and saliva were taken. At this point, he's still not given a phone call, and it's gone midnight. His parents have still not been informed of his arrest, and the interrogations were not recorded. Police at once told the media that they had arrested the killers, which make me question, can police say we've arrested the killers? I know they can say they've arrested a suspect, but aren't you innocent until proven guilty? The only thing holding the suspects was Jessie's confusing and wild, inaccurate confessions. And even if these confessions were accurate, and by the way, he recanted them immediately, remember? He took them all back. Even the prosecutor, Fogelman, acknowledges that at a trial, the statement of an accomplice alone is not sufficient. So they would have still needed more evidence to convict these kids. There's no DNA linking into the scene. And although polygraph results were not great, they're deemed unreliable and not admitted in court. Now, I want to introduce Gail Grinnell. She's a smart lady. She's Jason's mom. She advised him not to talk to the police, and the police were complaining to her that Jason was not talking. But she said it's because they put words in his mouth, like they did with Jessie. So she advised him, don't say anything. And at this point, she's still not been allowed to see him. Police are like, yeah, but we record everything, so we can't put words in his mouth. But we know that's absolute fucking bullshit because of what happened with Jessie. Gail got a report from Jason's school to say he was at school the day of the murders because they were, you know, still inconsistencies about the timings. But she's still not allowed to see her kid, which is crazy. I mean, land of the free, right? The judge, Rainey, who gave permission for these nighttime searches and arrests, now issues an order denying public review of these documents. And I don't know how that can be allowed. So he's basically issued this suspicious permission to search and arrest these kids at night, and then himself decides that the documents will not be allowed to be reviewed by the public. How is it not someone else's responsibility to do that? Do you know what I mean? It feels ripe for corruption there. It's also leaked that Rainey helped the police with their application for these arrests and searches, which is highly unusual. Okay, so we're going back to Aaron Hutchison again, right? Remember Vicky's kid, the 8-year-old who's friends with the suspect. He's now saying that he was there at the time of the murders and he witnessed the murders and can identify the killers. It's weird that he can suddenly remember so much,
and
right?
how can he be reliable when you've got his mother who's allegedly looking into the case as an undercover detective who's doing it for a reward, you know?
Yeah. Furthermore, there was apparently an altercation in Vicky Hutchison's neighborhood at the time of the disappearance of the kids. And neighbors remember seeing both her and Aaron there, so he physically could not have been there at the time of the murders. But he claims that he saw all 3 boys get castrated, something we know that didn't happen. He claimed that Jessie saw him and chased him, but Aaron tripped Jessie up and escaped, which sounds like something from a fucking movie. 4 days later, Aaron gets interviewed again. This is the 8th of June, so the 3 boys are in custody at the moment. And this interview is even more ridiculous. He says that Jessie called Aaron the night before the murders and told Aaron to bring friends to the woods, which is weird because can't they check this with the phone records? Aaron claims when he arrived, Michael and Chris were behind a tree or in a tree or something. And they saw them stab Stevie, who was not stabbed, according to the postmortem. Aaron claims that they tied him up, but he escaped within 40 seconds, which is an amazing feat for an 8-year-old, right? He also says he saw all 3 victims tied up with a rope. But you can see it's like wildly in different stories by an 8-year-old who's been led by what the community is gossiping
And
about,
his
what
mother,
the
who's
police are
trying to get
saying,
an answer. She's trying to solve the case that she can get her 35 grand, putting words in her son's mouth.
and also trying to get off this theft charge.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, in her defense, she's a single mom who doesn't want to be put in jail because what will happen to her kids. So, you know, I can kind of understand it's not right, but, you know, it's just again goes to show how you have to understand the context of everyone involved in an investigation, because everyone has an ulterior motive. Everyone has their motivations. Everyone has their pressures and their reasonings. Okay, so now an actual private investigator gets involved, called Ron Lax, and I think he might be my case crush. You know how I always have one. He's described as a meticulous dresser and a collector of French antiques. As soon as he hears about the case, he volunteers his services. He used to be pro-death penalty, but he's seen so many examples of bad policing leading to the conviction of innocent people that he is now strongly opposed to the death penalty. He believes, in quotation marks, that terrible crimes should equal life in prison. But, again, in quotation marks, he no longer considers the legal process reliable enough to warrant the imposition of such an irrevocable sentence. End quote. I mean, that's part of the reason why I'm opposed to the death penalty, because of these miscarriages of justice. It's also because I think, like with slapping a child, with spanking a child, you don't teach someone that something is wrong by doing it to them. But it's definitely up there in one of my reasons for being anti-death penalty. The fact that there are so many mistakes. And this is a prime example, right? So each defendant got appointed 2 lawyers by the state, like I said. Now, here's another thing that's fucked up. The state prosecutor had almost, I won't say unlimited budget, but they had a budget to spend on this. They were paid, and they had budgets to spend on experts, or experts in quotation marks, because we already talked about some of the experts they used. The defendants, it was not made clear to them how they, the defending lawyers, the defense lawyers, it wasn't made clear to them how they would be paid. They weren't given a budget. They only got paid a year and a half after the cases, after the trials, after taking the state to court. And this plays an impact, because how is that going to affect your motivation to work hard? And also, if you don't have a budget to hire experts, what does that mean? You know, like the prosecutors were getting experts left, right, and center, whereas they had to severely think about it. I mean, Jessie's lawyer had to take out bank loans in the name of his law firm because he wasn't getting paid. And he said he was working full time on this case because it was a big case. So Damien got Val Price and Scott Davidson. Jason got Paul Ford and George Robin Wadley. And Jessie got Dan Stidham and Greg Crow. Those were the lawyers. Most of them were in their 30s, and one of them was 27, and they were all very inexperienced with major crimes, and especially murder cases. So again, suspicious, right? I'm not saying they were bad lawyers, they were just inexperienced in this kind of case. Although they suspected that the kids were guilty at first, they soon realized that there was very little evidence against them, and very quickly realized that they were actually innocent. It was also clear that Jessie didn't even understand what a lawyer was, and that his lawyers were on his team and they weren't just more police officers. Jessie even asked his lawyer at one point who Satin was. And it took the lawyer a while to realize that Jessie meant Satan.
Oh, no.
So it's like this supposed Satanist murderer had to ask who Satan was.
Yeah. That's so sad.
I know. So Ron Lax, the private investigator, he decided to work with Val Price and Scott Davidson on Damien's defense, because that was kind of, Damien was the main suspect. Even Lax at the beginning assumed he was guilty, but very quickly realized he was not. A little bit more background on Damien. He was moved around a lot and his family were desperately poor. He was always teased, and Damien said he started carrying around a dog skull so that people would leave him alone. He would rather be teased for being odd than being poor, because he felt like it was something that he chose, you know? Damien says for a year and a half before the murders, he and Jason and Dominique had been hounded and harassed by the police, namely this Jerry driver. Damien was technically disabled because he was diagnosed with depression. His mental health deteriorated rapidly after the arrest. It's like, no shit, it would for anyone. He was not sleeping. He was crying a lot. He was hallucinating. He was becoming paranoid. He went on a hunger strike because he didn't feel like he could get a fair trial. He begged to be seen by a doctor, and I couldn't find any evidence of whether he was or not. Prosecutor Fogelman is, you know, obliged to share all of the evidence that he has with the defense team, with the defense teams, plural. He was committed to share all of this by August of 1993. By December, he still had not released all of the information. He wasn't drip feeding it as it was coming in either. It was all a mess. It was all over the place. He released stuff like just before Christmas that had occurred before the arrests, and, you know, lots of stuff was inaccurate or missing information, et cetera, et cetera. So the defense team had a huge task of just sorting out this information, which was obviously a ploy to keep them occupied, right? It was clear to Lax that Jessie's confession was obtained in a leading type interview, and he pointed out several places where police literally gave Jessie the answers they wanted from him. Lax goes off to find Vicky Hutchison to interview her. He said that she was nervous around him, and she said she didn't want to get involved, which is fucking ironic because she's the reason Jessie's in jail, and therefore Damien and Jason, because she got overly involved. She gave a really fuzzy account. She was really pissed off because she hadn't received the reward, et cetera, et cetera. At this point, a production company gets involved. They originally wanted to film the baby shower, Dominique's baby shower, because remember, Damien's girlfriend is pregnant and she's due in September time. They were arrested in June. This becomes what is eventually the Paradise Lost documentaries, which are very, very interesting and traumatizing. I think it's one of those cases where the documentary team didn't realize what they were getting involved in, you know, and how fucked up the situation actually was. So Lax spends much of his time just trying to organize the shit coming out of Fogelman's office. It's out of order, it's confusing, it's incomplete. For example, the 40 people that were fingerprinted, remember? Mentioned that 40 people were fingerprinted because they found a fingerprint at the scene of where the kids' bodies were found. There's no list of the names of the people fingerprinted, and there's no reason given why these different people were fingerprinted.
And also I wondered why you said only 11 of those had their urine tested. How did they whittle it down from 40 to 11 or whatever?
Well, we don't know, and we never will. One detective did something hilarious. Nearly a month after the arrest, so nearly 2 months after the murders, he decides to go back to where the bodies were found to look for more evidence. And guess what? He finds some, which seems highly unlikely. He finds 2 sticks supposedly used to beat the boys, because Jessie mentioned the boys being beaten by sticks. So lo and behold, they find these fucking sticks.
And how would they know that those were the sticks used?
They're just trying anything they can to make it more plausible. Jessie's confession more plausible, even though he recanted it. Lax was noticing that loads of stuff was getting sent off to the lab. He made a spreadsheet of all the things that were sent off for testing, and it was nearly 600 items, including 100 items of clothing, 87 hair samples, 17 knives, 3 sticks, 3 hammers, 5 ropes, an ice pick, etc., etc., etc. And out of everything, the lab only found one connection with the defendants, and they were a few fibers that were microscopically similar to fibers found in the homes of the 2 defendants. But they did not say they were from the exact same items, and these items were mass-produced and available everywhere and would have been found in multiple homes in the area. So hardly conclusive evidence, right? And you would have thought for such a grisly crime, especially not using a gun, but like more hands-on combat, sorry, that there would be more evidence linking these two, the victims to the suspects. All right, let's go to the trial. As mentioned, all three pleaded not guilty. They chose not to plead not guilty by reason of insanity because their defense was actual innocence. Jessie at the time was 17, Jason was 16, but they were tried as adults because it was a serious crime. Jason's lawyers argued that because of his background, he was a good student who hadn't really been seriously involved with the police, that he should be charged as a juvenile. This was denied. And Jessie's lawyers tried to argue that he was mentally not mature enough to stand trial as an adult. Mm-hmm. This was also denied. They did manage to get the trial held outside of the county because much of Jessie's confessions had been printed in the press, so they felt like they had to move it out of the county to get a fair trial. But the lawyers still felt like it wasn't moved far enough to secure a fair trial. Lawyers begged the judge to question Detective Gitchell, Detective Rich, and Allen under oath to ask them exactly why they focused on these three individuals in the first place, because that's still really unclear. Okay, because of satanic involvement, but what made them think there was satanic involvement in the first place? There's no evidence on the crime scene. They were not given permission to question the police officers under oath, which seems weird. Mm-hmm. During all this, Fogelman decides he has a bright idea to look in the lake behind Jason's trailer. So he gets professional divers to go there, and lo and behold, they find a 9-inch knife, like Deanna, Damien's previous girlfriend, said that he sometimes carried. It's never proven that it is actually Damien's knife, and these are a lot of like folk that like hunting and stuff like that, so it doesn't seem that weird. Fogelman claims that this evidence couldn't be planted because no one knew about the search. Yet, there's a picture in the press of a diver emerging with the knife. So how did the press know that the search was happening? If no one knew. And again, it was never proven that this knife belonged to Damien. Lax is still plowing through the documents that Fogelman is releasing. But for example, John Marks Byers' interview from before the arrest, so meaning in May time, was only released to the defense team before Christmas, 6 weeks before Jessie's trial. So they're not giving enough time for the defense team to really look into these discrepancies. For example, between Byers and his wife and the other son's statements. They also haven't explained, like I said, why Byers got worried so quickly about his stepson's disappearance. And like I said, it only emerged much later on that Vicky Hutchison was involved in an altercation with her neighbors that both her and Aaron were at when the kids supposedly went missing, meaning he could not possibly have witnessed the murder. Now I'm going to my trusty notebook, which is one of yours, by the way, because I was researching so late this one because I just couldn't let it go. And everything took me down different rabbit holes. So I didn't have time to type up all my notes. And I know you laugh because I take notes with a pen and paper, but I do. On the 17th of January, the day before the jury selection for Jessie's trial, Fogelman is still releasing documents. So that's how shiesty he's being. And he released a document that showed that on the 20th of December, the Moores and the Byers agreed to have their house searched, but no further information was given. So why are their houses being searched? Well, it turns out it's because the police received a knife in the post. A knife was FedExed to them. So listen to this. A knife with blood consistent with the blood of Chris Byers was FedExed to the police. Unfortunately, they could only find the blood type of this knife, which is also the blood type of 8% of the population and also of Chris Byers' stepdad. But still, it's curious, right? It turns out that this knife was sent to the police by the documentary makers. Weird, right?
What incentive? With what motive or incentive or reason?
Because they had initially recorded the baby shower. Then they decided to expand on their documentary remit and interview the families, the victims, etc., the suspects. And basically, they sent the knife to the police because John Mark Byers, Chris's stepdad, gave this knife to one of the crew members as a gift. And they had a moral dilemma because they were like, we're meant to be observers. We're not meant to be interfering in the case. But what if this is fucking crucial evidence in the murder of 3 children? So in the end, they decided to send the knife to the police. By the way, they mentioned that John Mark Byers, his interviews, like super creepy, where he talks a lot about the wrath of God and blah, blah, blah. Apparently the wives of the documentary makers had to leave the room when this footage was on because it was that creepy. So this gift to one of the crew members had blood on it, which is not that weird because he didn't claim it was a new knife. He said it was a used knife, and it's a hunting knife, and he does go hunting. But they were just suspicious enough to send this into the police, and they were like, let the police decide. But by this point, the trial is already underway. Can you imagine? Even though Fogelman promised to share all the documents by August, they're still sharing documents after the trial has started. And also, information about John Mark Byers' drug informant activities and the fact that he threatened to kill his ex-wife was never shared with defense lawyers. So they actively kept information, which is also highly illegal. Jessie's lawyers understandably wanted Byers to be interviewed immediately. The judge refused at first. Like, why? You know? Anyways, it was done, but they interviewed him in 45 minutes, which seems incredibly quick. Defense lawyers didn't want local police doing the interview because they had suspicions about the local police, but the local police did it anyways. Byers couldn't give an answer about why there was blood on the knife. He gave him conflicting evidence. Like at one point he said he never used the knife, then he said he used the knife on a deer, then he said blah, 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 you know. Couldn't explain why there was human blood on the knife. So because there wasn't enough time to go down this route, Jessie's lawyers decided not to mention this in the trial because it's a really bad look to accuse the stepdad of one of the kids, the murdered kids, of potentially being involved if you don't have evidence. It looks like you're trying to fucking just throw the blame on someone else. But if they had this evidence sooner, if they had any of this evidence sooner, then they could have investigated this thoroughly in advance. Which is such a shame. As mentioned, Dr. Offshay, the actual expert, professor of sociology at Berkeley, who's an expert in police coercion, says that Jessie's confession is coerced compliance statement, meaning a false statement, one that comes about because an individual can no longer stand the strain of the interrogation. It's just so sad. And gives me Making a Murderer vibes, season 2, remember?
Yes, the nephew, right?
Yeah. And he points out 8 times alone where the police manipulated Jessie on the time of the crime. So just on that one point, he can identify 8 times where the police manipulated the answers. Jesse's verdict, he was convicted of first-degree murder for Michael Moore, and the other 2 murders, second-degree murder. So he got life in prison plus 40 years. The prosecutor needed Jessie to testify at the next trial, and they were hoping that they could convince him to, like, you know, do a little plea bargain to help convict the other 2. But Jessie didn't want to. So they start doing really random things to put pressure on him. For example, they drove him 3 hours away to a prison. So he's on his own, just taken randomly to somewhere he's unfamiliar with. He's just been convicted of murder. You know, this poor boy is still a child. He's scared, right? Again, he says that he saw the boys being beaten and raped. But then he says that they weren't tied up this time and that he left before the murders. But eventually he decides not to testify. So again, once he gets parental support and lawyers up, he decides not to. The prosecutors still want him to testify, so they move him to a prison 40 miles away without telling his parents or his lawyers until he is actually there. Cut out a lot of this, but basically they're putting pressure on Jessie to testify against the other two, but Jessie doesn't want to. Then at the second trial, more shitstorm, more crazy stuff. I mean, the prosecutor in his closing statement reads one of Damien's creepy poems.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's your closing statement, is a teenager's fucking weird poetry shit.
Oh, I thought you were gonna read it.
No, I'm not gonna read it because it was bullshit, but it's like, you know, it's a child's poem.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the jury deliberate and they are both sentenced, like I said, Damien Echols to the death penalty and Jason Baldwin to life in prison. They all file appeals. Jessie first. 7 Supreme Court justices note that Jessie's confession is a confusing amalgam of times and dates, but still enough to support the conviction.
Mm-hmm.
That seems contradictory, right? Jason and Damien also appeal regularly, but the Supreme Court's justices in this case say that although all the evidence is circumstantial, there is still enough evidence to stand by the conviction, which makes me think of Levi Belfield, right? Season 1, episode 2, Levi Belfield, a case where there was absolutely no DNA evidence and it was all circumstantial, but that was fucking ironclad, right?
Mm-hmm.
There were police records, there was phone records, there was video footage of
the
multiple
bus.
cars, buses, and
his van.
you know, reports from witnesses, girlfriends, etc., etc. Like, it was all circumstantial, but there was so much fucking evidence, and then they just piled on more and more circumstantial evidence because they knew if we don't have DNA, we got to make sure this is fucking airtight. There was none of this shit in this case at all for any one of the 3 suspects. Some of the evidence, for example, the circumstantial evidence, was that Damien admitted an interest in the occult. Doesn't seem like evidence of anything apart from an interest in the occult. He had drawn a pentagram on a piece of paper once. He has copied out spells. He had a long black trench coat. The 3 of them were seen together in the months before the murder with staffs, and the boys were hit with sticks. But, like, seems just fucking clutching at straws here. Expert Dr. Dale Griffiths, remember, from the unaccredited university, he says that 3 and 8 are significant numbers. So the fact that it was 3 boys and they were 8-year-old, because 3 and 8 are
significant in the occult.
In the occult, yeah. But it's like, if you believe that, if you're looking at numerology, then each number is significant in its own way. Mm-hmm. Each number means something, so it's completely cuckoo bananas. The documentary was released in 1996. It was called Paradise Lost, The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills. Very much indicated that there was a lot of miscarriages of justice. And a website was soon set up called WM3.org, which is still up. At the time, it had updates and merch. Now it has the Facebook and Instagram links for Jason Baldwin and Damien Echols, and a postal address for Jessie Misskelley. I have contacted Jason Baldwin and I'm awaiting his response. I told him we were recording this episode. I saw in his Instagram comments something about a petition, and I wondered if there was any call to action that he might want our readers, our listeners, to take.
So those 3 boys, are they still in prison?
I'll get to it.
Oh.
So as a result of the documentary and the website, loads of support started appearing for the boys, because it was absolutely ridiculous. Like, anyone could see that there was just so little evidence, right? Vicky has come forth, Vicky Hutchison again has come forth annoyed that she hasn't got the reward money. She starts saying she never signed a release form to have a recording device in her bedroom. And that Aaron was often interrogated without her present, which is awful because again, he's an 8-year-old boy. She started to think that maybe it was John Mark Byers. So she met with the defense lawyers and with Lax. So she's now changing sides. Mark and Melissa Byers actually moved away soon after, leaving behind loads of debt. And in September 1994, so a couple of months after the convictions, they were arrested for theft of antiques worth more than $20,000 from a house near theirs. They posted bail, and 2 weeks later, Mark Byers was arrested again for contributing to delinquency of a minor, which sounds awful, but basically it is awful. Basically, he encouraged a kid to play with a knife, and the kid seriously injured himself. Like, what kind of fucking person are you? So people start looking closer at Byers. Remember, this is after the conviction of the 3 suspects.
And we haven't talked about Mr. Bojangles.
Mr. Bojangles has fallen off the radar. There's nothing more.
Oh my God, I thought he was going to make a reappearance.
No, sadly not, because basically any evidence they did have, the blood sample, gone. Anything that they saw about a black man in the area potentially was dismissed, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
At 17, John Mark Byers' mom, I'm going to call him Byers Sr. from now on. Byers Sr.'s mom called the police on him because he was threatening her with a butcher's knife. 1990, Byers Sr. and Melissa worked at a jewelry store together when $65,000 was stolen. Remember, Melissa was a heroin addict and she had been since the age of 12. So again, someone's failed that girl there, because how does a 12-year-old become addicted to heroin? We barely smoked a spliff by that point, you know? By the end of 1994, the Byers were facing 12 misdemeanor charges. Neighbors had restraining orders on them. There were charges of burglary, and Mark was charged with this minor delinquency thingy. They were also both suspects in the explosion of a neighbor's motorhome. This was the same neighbor that they were charged with stealing from. Melissa had a separate charge of aggravated assault when she pulled a gun on a carpet fitter who refused to do a job until the floor was cleaned. Which seems like a situation that escalated quickly and unnecessarily.
Yeah.
And then 3 years after the murder, Melissa Byers, the mother of Chris Byers, one of the murder victims, is pronounced dead unexpectedly. So this is 29th of March, 1996. An ambulance is called to the Byers' home at 5:20 p.m. Melissa is found unconscious and pronounced dead an hour and 10 minutes later in hospital. Doctors could find no evidence of trauma or reason for this sudden death. The state police were called immediately because this was viewed as a possible homicide. There were lots of IV puncture marks, but it was not noted whether they were done at the hospital when trying to revive her or done previously. Witnesses have said at this point that Mark had a new girlfriend called Mandy, which is suspect. The police are searching the house and they speak to a neighbor, the neighbor who called the ambulance. This neighbor says that Byers called him and told him that he couldn't wake Melissa up, and could the neighbor call an ambulance, come over? And the neighbor said, why don't you just call an ambulance? But Byers Sr. insisted that this neighbor comes over and checks it out. Seems suspicious again. So the neighbor goes around, sees that Melissa is naked and unconscious, and calls an ambulance immediately. So an autopsy is done, but the results take more than 6 months, and anyways are super inconclusive because, in quotes, they are unable to determine either a physical cause of her death or the legal manner of her death. Drugs were found in her system, but they weren't a lethal amount. So really,
was she naked?
Really unusual. Well, Byers Sr. claims that they were taking a nap together, and he couldn't wake her up, which is very unusual. Okay, here's some light relief, because we need some, right?
Oh, thank God. Give me some light relief. Okay.
Because at this point, I'm thinking, this fucking Byers Sr. is like Teflon.
Yeah.
He's being accused of so much shit. Like, you saw the list of things he's...
And is this all because he's an informant?
It's hard to tell, because obviously we'll never know as civilians. But basically, he is like Teflon. He avoids jail time like there's no tomorrow. But then he makes a wrong call. Like, literally, he dials the wrong number.
Oh my God. Okay.
So he calls a number, and he says, "Want to buy some more pot?"
Who did he call?
The guy who answers says, "Yeah, sure." But the guy who answers says, "I'm kind of busy right now with a girl, but I'm going to send my friend Jeff." And the guy says, like, "I don't really remember. I remember where your house is, but I don't know the street names and the house number and stuff. Can you please just give me the directions?" So Byers Sr. gives very clear directions how to get to his house to buy drugs from him. So it turns out that he accidentally called a state trooper.
Oh, this is a good one.
This reminded me again of Levi Belfield, when Levi Belfield reported his Pakistani neighbor for being a terrorist, when the neighbor actually turned out to be Italian, but Levi Belfield actually gave his actual phone number, and that's how one of the ways that they managed to tie him to this mobile phone. So yeah, he's actually called a state trooper and offered to sell him drugs. The state trooper arranges for an undercover drugs officer to go to the house, and Jeff, in quotation marks, makes a purchase and then arrests Byers. Byers is sentenced to 5 years, but this is then suspended. But because of a previous burglary conviction, which was also suspended, he ends up having to do jail time for 8 years, which I don't think he served the entire time. But he finally spends some time in jail. At this point, some of the parents of the victims are starting to doubt whether the 3 people in jail are the actual murderers. And they are the one with the most vested interest in finding the true killers, right?
So if Byers Sr. was responsible, why the 2 other boys?
Maybe they were just there at the time and witnesses. Because Chris Byers' body was treated slightly different. It's unclear whether the genital mutilation was done by an animal post-mortem or whether it was part of the attack. But he was also stabbed, so he was treated slightly differently in the attacks. So was it that he was the main victim? Chris Byers' bio dad, Rick Murray, doesn't think that the West Memphis Three, the 3 in jail, killed his son. And later on, one of the other parents, I think it was Pamela Hobbs, also doesn't think it is the 3. Okay, so since the trials, a criminal profiler has come forth saying the boys were killed elsewhere with light. Because of the nature of the crimes, there must have been light for the murderer or murderers to be able to do what they did. And if that's the case, they must have then been transported in a vehicle. So that's 2 other crime scenes that are not identified. There were cases where a film had led to cases being reopened. And so the documentary filmmakers produced a sequel where they really wanted to start putting pressure and leverage and momentum on getting this case reopened. Music bands start showing a lot of support for their fellow weirdos, because they don't want their fans to be fucking accused of murder just because they are fans of those bands, right? We got it a little bit because we went to American schools and we liked 9 Inch Nails and, you know, Marilyn Manson and stuff, but we just got called names. We didn't get fucking arrested for murder. But basically, Rocket from the Crypt, L7, The Breeders, etc., Eddie Vedder, Joe Strummer, and Killing Joke, and a bunch of others made an album in support of the West Memphis Three.
Oh my God, how did we miss that? I forgot that. Yeah, I never knew about that one.
Yeah, so I think, again, because we were in the UK, we missed a lot of this, right? I'm going to put a link to this album on Spotify in the show notes, because I listened to it a bit this morning as I was getting ready. It's fucking awesome. It's awesome. Because they were like, you know, like I said, their fans are being persecuted. This isn't a very extreme example, but this was happening a lot. Trey Parker, one of the co-creator of South Park, also started supporting them. And there was some debate about whether it's helpful or useful for controversial figures to be supporting. Is it adding more controversy? But I think if you fucking have a platform to show your support or your opinion on a matter, then fucking use it. So I'm cool with this. And I also love South Park. They were also getting more and more support in the press, because I think people are starting to move on and realize we're in the 2000s now, how fucking backwards everything about how the case was handled was. And also Satanic Panic has kind of died down a little bit, right? As I mentioned, the defense lawyers were not paid until they went to court to get their payment a year and a half later. They were not given the budget to hire expert witnesses in the same way as the prosecutors did, which I think is incredibly wrong. They also later on got a forensic dentist to come in and take the mold of the West Memphis Three. I'm going to call them that now, the 3 people in jail for the murders, because there were bite marks on Stevie's face. The forensic dentist says that none of these 3 people could have left those bite marks, which says a lot. And there was another dentist that came in to visit the coroner's office who said that the bite marks weren't on Stevie's face weren't human, and therefore this was irrelevant.
That's what I was going to say, because you said that they weren't sure about some of the injuries, whether they were caused by animals.
But this dentist that came in to look at the and gave this contradictory report actually was never hired to do this, never took any notes at the coroner's office, and never produced a report. So he kind of was just coming along and giving his opinion, but it doesn't seem very formal. Let's go back to John Mark Byers, who, if he's not guilty for these 3 murders, is definitely a massive piece of shit. Because at the time that everyone is talking about teeth and bite marks, guess what happens to him?
Oh, God.
He has all his teeth removed. Now he claims
oh my God.
He claims it's because he's on medicine for a brain tumor that affects his teeth. But there's conflicting reports about whether removing all his teeth was necessary. It just seems very fucking extra to do if you don't need to, right? So 8 years later, 8 years after the murders, DNA has progressed. And they wanted to test the knife that Byers gave to the crew member, remember? There's loads of support from the West Memphis Three website. They have like a postcard campaign to show the support to reopen this. And a date is set to look at more DNA evidence. By the way, let's have a look at the police officers. Gary Gitchell resigned 2 months after the second trial. Detective Allen is promoted to captain, but he's criticized heavily during the documentary, so is Bryn Ridge. Jerry Driver was placed on administrative leave in February 1997 after an audit of his department found a shortage of nearly $30,000. He resigned soon after. He was ordered to repay the $30,000 at $241 a month. So I was like, I wonder how long that would take. That means that it would take him 10 and a half years to pay back, without interest, pay back the money he stole from his department, meaning from the taxpayer. And this is, again, someone heavily involved in the conviction of Damien Echols. December 1999, we mentioned hybristophilia. Damien marries someone, a lady called Lori Davis, who's a New York architect. They had started a correspondence and got married. Jason Baldwin's in jail for ages, taking loads of courses, and starts a romance in 1997 with a lady called Sarah Cadwallader. I'm not sure if they're still together. Now, this is kind of where The Devil's Knot book ends, but she released a second book, which goes more into detail about the aftermath if you want to do that. But I have talked for a long, long time, so I'm going to give you some of the details. By 2007, papers were filed by Echols' defense lawyers seeking a retrial because of the DNA evidence linking Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of one of the victims, to the crime scene, and new statements from Hobbs' new ex-wife. So now we've got another fucking stepfather involved who sounds suspicious. And remember, this is two of the ways that Steve Keogh says that cold cases can be solved. New evidence.
People's loyalties changing.
Yeah, new DNA evidence that, you know, because science progresses, and people's loyalties changing.
So I always wondered, why do people suddenly come out the woodwork 20, 30 years later? And like, I guess sometimes it's just the fear of like maybe the person they were afraid of is no longer around, their loyalty changes. Yeah, so interesting.
Right? Judge Barnett denies a retrial based on this. Then on the 19th of August 2011, the three are released. So they are out of jail now. But this is as part of a plea deal. Remember the staircase? Did you watch the staircase?
Yeah.
Remember
the
Alford plea?
No.
Okay, so he also pleads the Alford plea, but that's the last time I want to make similarities with these West Memphis Three and that fucking piece of shit. So the Alford plea is, in quotation marks, a legal mechanism that allows defendants to plead guilty while still asserting their actual innocence in cases where the defendants acknowledge that prosecutors have sufficient evidence to secure a conviction. So basically, I'm innocent, but I know you have enough to prove that I'm guilty. So I'll say I'm guilty, but let me off early because I've said that I'm guilty and I'm actually innocent. So it seems like a weird one, right? So a new trial is ordered and they are all released with time served and a suspended 10-year sentence. So if they reoffend, they have to go back to prison for 21 years, I think it was. What helped was the massive amount of public support, and also that two of the victims' families now believed that they were innocent. That was Pamela Hobbs, the mother of Stevie, and Rick Murray, the bio dad of Chris Byers. So they were getting vocal support from two of the victims' family members. In late 2007, even John Mark Byers states that he thinks the West Memphis Three are innocent. But I have to ask, is this a narcissist cry for attention or an attempt to remain relevant? Because what the fuck do you want, John Mark Byers? You're a piece of shit. So, like I said, if you go to the West Memphis Three website, you'll see they've all been released. You can find their contact details if you want.
They've all been released.
2000? So it was in 2011, I think I said. So they served nearly 20 years in prison. They got released under the Alford plea for time served. So I don't know whether that means they are by law guilty or by law innocent, but they were released. I know from my Instagram stalking of Jason Baldwin, which was super easy to do because he has 4 posts, that he's involved. He's an activist now, very heavily involved in, you know, similar situations like the cases that the Innocence Project works with about people wrongfully convicted, in particular to death sentence. And I'm gonna I'll put links to this in the show notes, obviously, but I followed Jason Baldwin. I didn't follow Damien Echols because it just didn't seem like an Instagram account that I wanted to follow. He seems to be a kind of spiritual leader of sorts. He's only got 10 posts. The most recent one was 9 hours ago. So he's active. He's advertising a retreat. Let's see what the retreat is. Oh, the Magnum Opus School of High Magic, Unveiling Your Holy Guardian Angel. October 13th to 15th, so still time to book on if you want. It's in Sugarloaf, New York. He's an acclaimed author and practitioner of ceremonial magic, having practiced the art for over 30 years. His story was made famous by the Paradise Lost documentaries, which depicted his wrongful conviction. He's led several classes and workshops across the states, etc., etc. He's the founder and chief instructor of the Magnus Opus School of High Magic. Let's see how much it costs. Limited to 60 people. It's not bad. For a 3-day event, it's $750, which I presume includes accommodation. Or you can live stream it for $250, which includes the entire retreat, including all classes, exercises, lessons, rituals, etc.
Wow, I wonder why we got into that line of work.
Well, he obviously had an interest in the occult already. That's what got him into trouble. And probably couldn't get employed when he left work, so had to work for himself.
Yeah.
Right? And then I was happy to see...
Yeah, tell me about Jessie.
Jessie, he's got a postal address, care of Stephanie Dollar, so not direct, and no direct Instagram or Facebook, which to me, he seemed like the most vulnerable out of the three. And so I'm happy that he's not so public and, you know what I mean, so easy to find and contact.
How old are they? How old are they now?
Well, they were 16, 17, 18-ish in 1993. So...
In their 40s?
Yeah. So basically, the oldest one is about 8 years older than me. So they're basically between 46 and 48 years old now. So still young, you know? So luckily, they seem to be... I don't know, actually, because I was looking at Jason's Instagram. Let me tell you about his. Like I said, I contacted him because I wanted to know if there was any call to actions. He hasn't replied yet. I don't know if he ever will, but if he does, I will definitely make sure that we post about it and put it in the subject notes.
So basically, Buyer Senior, what's he up to these days? He never got convicted.
He never got convicted of anything. It seems like Jason, according to a post from the 15th of June, so last month, these are recent posts. I wonder if something's happening that they're all posting recently, because they don't have very many posts. It says he has 2 jobs and can't make ends meet in his frugal life. And he had to quit his job because he was hoping for a pay rise and he couldn't afford to keep that job anymore, which says a lot. And then he also makes a video post where he says, thank you for support and generosity. I think there is some kind of campaign to donate to him, which is what I also asked for links for. He doesn't have any links in his bio, so there's nowhere to go. And he says he's an egalitarian, compurgator of DE and JLM Jr. Oh. Compurgator of Damien Echols and Jessie Misskelley Jr., subject of Paradise Lost, Devil's Knot, and Dark Spell, which are the documentaries and books about him. Yeah, so
that story is, I was really hoping for some sort of positive resolution at the end. That,
I mean, at least they're not still in prison, but that was a massive miscarriage of justice as far as I'm concerned.
So many things are just so sad about it.
Like, even if I thought for a minute they were guilty, I would still have to say that that case was mishandled so badly from start to finish that even if they were guilty, how could you convict them of it? Because you didn't manage to compile enough actual evidence and everything else.
And do you think it is Buyer Senior?
I think it's hard to tell. Buyer Senior is definitely fucking a nasty piece of work. But then who the fuck is Mr. Bojangles? We will never know now. We will never know. And what else was like slipped through the cracks because they just didn't look into it because it didn't support what they wanted to support. We just don't know.
I really was hoping by the end of this we'd know exactly who did it, and that, oh God, something concrete, some sort of resolution.
And they clearly have to like make it obvious who they are every turn, because if they don't, then people are going to Google them and find out and think there's something suspicious about that. I don't know. It's just really sad. Gina, I can totally see why this case got you, because it got me. I do remember bits and bobs about it, and I had watched a documentary or two about it, but it's not until investigating, like with so many cases, it's not until like proper deep diving that I realized how fucked up it was.
And I hate anything to do with kids, and these are like 3 small kids, and
whose murderers are still technically out there.
Yeah, I just,
it's horrible.
Yeah.
So yeah, I remember at the time loads of Free the West Memphis Three t-shirts and stuff at concerts and whatever. But yeah, it wasn't a case that I had followed very closely. I just remember it as being one of those satanic panic fucking bullshit cases.
And God, I mean, there's no accountability for the corruption of the police, and you know, in this, that we're supposed to be investigating all this, you know. I wouldn't want them investigating any sort of fucking crime, you know, when they're.
And you would have thought these police officers that are under investigation themselves, when offered support from the state level police, that they're not offered the support, that they are told you will receive this support. Because your team are already under investigation, so I'm not sure you should be handling a major crime. And also, I mean, how much experience do they have in these kind of things? Probably not very much. Not as much as the state level police team would, you know? So there's just so many times where it's like, sorry, what? You know, and so many occasions right from the start of the victims' lives, you know, the 3 boys that were murdered and the West Memphis Three, right from their childhood, where they were failed time and time again by the adults in their life, by the system, the systems in place, the education system, the social welfare system, you know, the healthcare system, the mental health care system, and the police, most importantly, that led to this fucking, like I said several times, this perfect shitstorm that allowed for this situation to happen. Add to that religious views that are very narrow and discriminatory.
And the meddling of people like Vicky, you know? Like, just all these complicating factors of poor judgment, lack of support for people who needed it, just, oh God, poverty thrown in, every fucking miserable thing.
It's just sadness upon sadness, isn't it? So I hope that they are managing to have some kind of existence. But I can't imagine that they're not traumatized. Because let's not forget, they also spent 20 years in what I assume is a maximum security prison. It's fucking awful, you know?
Oh God.
At a young age.
My day fucking ruined.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. I mean, you know, we're here to talk about
before we go, I have a couple of more. Well, I want to show one picture in particular. And here are the pictures of the 3 that were arrested. I mean, look, they're kids. Look at their little weird haircuts. Do you know what I mean?
Oh my God, that story is fucking awful. Oh.
Yep.
It started bad. It started bad with the murder of 3 kids. And it just, you know, most of the cases, they make you realize you're not safe anywhere.
Sorry, I need to eat my feelings. I'm just gonna have a bit of chocolate to cheer me up.
Yeah, most of the cases make you realize you're not safe anywhere, especially ones like with the Liz Goliar case, where some psycho can come into your life and fuck shit up for you.
From anywhere.
But also the people you're supposed to trust, i.e. the police, that you can't always take that for granted that you can. So it's just, this case just, it's so saddening.
It's so dark. So, Gina, I don't hate you. I'm sorry you had to live with more intimate knowledge of this case for longer than I did, because that, no wonder it still makes you cry. Listen, Rhonda, what are we going to do? How are we going to end episodes in season 2? We spent the whole of season 1 debating this.
Oh, I don't know. We really need to think about it because we have really ended on a sad note here.
I mean, I'm ending by eating a dime bar because but I don't think that's particularly interesting.
I was just thinking, what can I get from the petrol station that tastes nice to cheer me up?
May I recommend a dime bar? Right, so I think we need to do not a poll where you give 2 shit answers, but can we do a more open-ended poll with suggestions? Can we just ask the listeners?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that. Let's see what
something realistic. Don't fucking make it an Irish jig because I'm going to struggle to do an Irish jig every time.
Or anything that requires even more podcast research. Because we're time poor.
We're time poor. Yeah, have a little think. I know some podcasts end with a joke. Other podcasts end with a happy story from the readers, from the listeners.
I like that one.
Yeah, it's nice. It is cute. Well, why don't we start with us? Did something good happen to you this week?
So what
Speaking of crime,
I think I know what you're gonna say.
Che got an award.
Okay, so yeah, yesterday at the kids' school, and I try not to talk about like my kid-related stuff because nobody wants to hear about other
Yes, but this is true crime related.
But it is, and funny you should mention that because so yesterday the my kids' school gave me certificates that they received at school, and Rio, because she is just magic and lightness, she got the Magical Music Award. And because she sings all the time. And then Che, and I'm going to read it out what it actually says on his certificate, because you know what? I actually sent it to Stephen Keogh and Colin Sutton. And I said,
no way.
I did. I said, my son too works in law enforcement. So Che got the Certificate of Playground Policeman Award. And this is what it said. He's self-elected, I might add. Self-elected. This is not an official award that the school...
That's not an official qualification. It qualifies him to have a podcast on the topic, surely.
So this is what they said. This award is presented to Che for being the school playground policeman. Che rides the police car during outside play each day to ensure that teachers and peers are following the school rules. That big copy. If they are not, Che will pull up alongside them and issue a reminder. And it just made me laugh because, you know, the other funny and ironic thing is that he doesn't follow rules. And they tell me all the time about his negative behavior. But
I mean, if there was ever an example of a bent copper, it's Che.
Yeah, or a cult, like we've said this before, he's got the makings of a cult leader because he's got charm and charisma. He doesn't follow his own rules, but he damn well wants everyone else to follow the black and white rules. And it's
not to mention the other day he told me that he was my inspirational leader.
He did. Yeah, so that was a funny thing that happened this week.
Right, so that's lightened the mood a little bit.
Yeah, that has, yeah. But still waiting to hear back from Colin Sutton.
Yeah, can you post that certificate on our socials because it's super cute. All right, well, listeners, sorry to fuck you up so much, and we love you, and we're so happy you're back.
Gina, well done, Gina.
Good choice. I hope I did you justice. I hope I did the West Memphis Three justice. Oh, all right.
Pick something lighter on a lighter note next week.
My next topic is lighter.
Oh, thank fuck. We do need to mix it up because it's like my nervous system is broken.
Yeah. But if you want to have complete control over what we say and do, then sign up to our Patreon, the highest tier level, and you get to choose. All right. See you all next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey there. Thanks for being a loyal listener.
Do you need a new website or want to boost your social media performance? Or do you hate podcast editing? You've tried optimizing your website and social media channels, but you're still not getting the listeners, downloads, and engagement you want?
We, the Sadcase Sisters, love helping people with tasks that they hate. We know a thing or two about podcasts, websites, and social media, and we love working with other podcasters and business owners.
So why not head over to switchbladesisterssocialclub.com and go to our Work With Us section. We believe in collaboration over competition. A rising tide raises all ships.
Bye!